Book 2, Chapter 14 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nikki Sullivan. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 2, The Hired Girls. Chapter 14. The day after commencement, I moved my books and desk upstairs to an empty room where I should be undisturbed, and I fell to studying in earnest. I worked off a year's trigonometry that summer, and began Virgil alone. Morning after morning, I used to pace up and down my sunny little room, looking off at the distant river bluffs and the roll of the blonde pastures between, scanning the Aeneid aloud, and committing long passages to memory. Sometimes in the evening, Mrs. Harling came to me as I passed her gate and asked me to come in and let her play for me. She was lonely for Charlie, she said, and liked to have a boy about. Whenever my grandparents had misgivings and began to wonder whether I was not too young to go off to college alone, Mrs. Harling took up my cause vigorously. Grandfather had such respect for her judgment that I knew he would not go against her. I had only one holiday that summer. It was in July. I met Antonia downtown on Saturday afternoon and learned that she and Tiny and Lena were going to the river next day with Anna Hansen. The elder was all in bloom now, and Anna wanted to make elder-blow wine. Anna's to drive us down in the marshal's delivery wagon, and we'll take a nice lunch and have a picnic. Just us, nobody else. Couldn't you happen along, Jem? It would be like old times. I considered a moment. Maybe I can, if I won't be in the way. On Sunday morning, I rose early and got out of Black Hawk while the dew was still heavy on the long meadow grasses. It was the high season for summer flowers. The pink bee brush stood tall along the sandy roadsides, and the cone flowers and rose mallow grew everywhere. Across the wire fence in the long grass, I saw a clump of flaming orange-colored milkweed, rare in that part of the state. I left the road and went around through a stretch of pasture that was always cropped short in the summer, where the gaillardia came up year after year and matted over the ground with a deep velvety red that is in Bokhara carpets. The country was empty and solitary except for the larks that Sunday morning, and it seemed to lift itself up to me and come very close. The river was running strong for midsummer. Heavy rains to the west of us had kept it full. I crossed the bridge and went upstream along the wooded shore to a pleasant dressing room I knew among the dogwood bushes, all overgrown with wild grapevines. I began to undress for a swim. The girls would not be along yet. For the first time it occurred to me that I would be homesick for that river after I left. The sandbars, with their clean white beaches and their little groves of willows and cottonwood seedlings, were the sort of no-man's land, little newly created worlds that belonged to the Black Hawk boys. Charlie Harling and I hunted through these woods, fished from the fallen logs, and until I knew every inch of the river shores and had a friendly feeling for every bar and shallow. After my swim, while I was playing about indolently in the water, I heard the sound of hoofs and wheels on the bridge. I struck downstream and shouted as the open spring wagon came into view on the middle stand. They stopped the horse, and the two girls in the bottom of the cart stood up, steadying themselves by the shoulders of the two in front, so that they could see me better. They were charming up there, huddled together in the cart and peering down at me like curious deer when they come out of the thicket to drink. I found bottom near the bridge and stood up, waving to them. "How pretty you look," I called. "So do you," they shouted all together, and broke into peals of laughter. Anna Hansen shook the reins as they drove on, while I zigzagged back to my inlet and clambered up behind the overhanging elm. I dried myself in the sun and dressed slowly, reluctant to leave that green enclosure where the sunlight flickered so bright through the grapevine leaves, and the woodpecker hammered away in the crooked elm that trailed out over the water. As I went along the road back to the bridge, I kept picking off little pieces of scaly chalk from the dried water gullies and breaking them up in my hands. When I came upon the marshal's delivery horse, tied in the shade, the girls had already taken their baskets and gone down the east road, which wound through the sand and scrub. I could hear them calling to each other. The elder bushes did not grow back in the shady ravines between the bluffs, but in the hot, sandy bottoms along the stream, where the roots were always in moisture and their tops in the sun. The blossoms were unusually luxuriant and beautiful that summer. I followed a cattle path through the thick underbrush until I came to a slope that fell away abruptly to the water's edge. A great chunk of the shore had been bitten out by some spring freshet, and the scar was masked by elder bushes growing down to the water in flowery terraces. I did not touch them. I was overcome by content and drowsiness by the warm silence about me. There was no sound but the high, sing-song buzz of wild bees and the sunny gurgle of the water underneath. I peeped over the edge of the bank to see the little stream that made the noise. It flowed along perfectly clear over the sand and gravel, cut off from the muddy main current by a long sandbar. Down there, on the lower shelf of the bank, I saw Antonia, seated alone under the pagoda-like elders. She looked up when she heard me and smiled, but I saw that she had been crying. I slid down into the soft sand beside her and asked what was the matter. "It makes me homesick, Jimmy, this flower, this smell, she said softly. "We have this flower very much at home in the old country. It always grew in our yard, and my papa had a green bench and a table under the bushes. In the summer, when they were in bloom, he used to sit there with his friend that played the trombone. When I was little, I used to go down there to hear them talk, beautiful talk, like what I never hear in this country." "What did they talk about?" I asked her. She sighed and shook her head. "Oh, I don't know. About music, and the woods, and about God, and when they were young." She turned to me suddenly and looked into my eyes. "You think, Jimmy, that maybe my father's spirit can go back to those old places?" I told her about the feeling of her father's presence I had on the winter day when my grandparents had gone over to see his dead body, and I was left alone in the house. I said I felt sure then that he was on his way back to his own country, and that even now, when I had passed his grave, I always thought of him as being among the woods and fields that were so dear to him. Antonia had the most trusting, responsive eyes in the world. Love and credulousness seemed to look out from them with open faces. "Why didn't you ever tell me that before? It makes me feel more sure for him." After a while she said, "You know, Jim, my father was different from my mother. He did not have to marry my mother, and all his brothers quarreled with him because he did. I used to hear the old people at my home whisper about it. They said he could have paid my mother money and not married her. But he was older than she was, and he was too kind to treat her like that. He lived in his mother's house, and she was a poor girl come in to do the work. After my father married her, my grandmother never let my mother come into her house again. When I went to my grandmother's funeral, it was the first and only time I was ever in my grandmother's house. Don't that seem strange?" While she talked, I lay back in the hot sand and looked up at the blue sky between the flat bouquets of elder. I could hear the bees humming and singing, but they stayed up in the sun above the flowers and did not come down into the shadow of the leaves. Antonia seemed to me that day exactly like the little girl who used to come to our house with Mr. Shimerda. "Some day, Tony, I am going over to your country, and I am going to the little town where you lived. Do you remember all about it?" "Jim," she said earnestly, "if I was ever put down there in the middle of the night, I could find my way all over that little town, and along the river to the next town, where my grandmother lived. My feet remember all the little paths through the woods, and where the big roots stick out to trip you. I ain't never forgot my own country." There was a crackling in the branches above us, and Lena Lingard peered down over the edge of the bank. "You lazy things," she cried. "All this elder, and you two lying there. Didn't you hear us calling you?" Almost as flushed as she had been in my dream, she leaned over the edge of the bank and began to demolish our flowery pagoda. I had never seen her so energetic. She was panting with zeal, and the perspiration stood in drops on her short, yielding upper lip. I sprang to my feet and ran up the bank. It was noon now, and so hot that the dogwoods and scrub oaks began to turn up the silvery underside of their leaves, and all the foliage looked soft and wilted. I carried the lunch basket to the top of the chalk bluffs, where even on the calmest days there was always a breeze. The flat-topped, twisted little oaks threw light shadows on the grass. Below us we could see the windings of the river and Black Hawk, grouped among its trees, and beyond, the rolling country swelling gently until it met the sky. We could recognize familiar farmhouses and windmills. Each of the girls pointed out to me the direction in which her father's farm lay, and told me how many acres were in wheat that year and how many in corn. "My old folks," said Tiny Solderball, "have put in 20 acres of rye. They get it ground at the mill, and it makes nice bread. It seems like my mother ain't been so homesick ever since my father's raised rye flour for her." "It must have been trial for our mothers," said Lena, "coming out here and having to do everything different. My mother had always lived in town. She says she started behind in farm work and has never caught up." "Yes, a new country's hard on the old ones sometimes," said Anna thoughtfully. "My grandmother's getting feeble now, and her mind wanders. She's forgot about this country, and she thinks she's home in Norway. She keeps asking Mother to take her down to the waterside and the fish market. She craves fish all the time. Whenever I go home, I take her canned salmon and mackerel." "Mercy, it's hot," Lena yawned. She was supine under a little oak, resting after the fury of her elder hunting, and had taken off her high-heeled slippers she had been silly enough to wear. "Come here, Jim. You never got the sand out of your hair." She began to draw her fingers slowly through my hair. Antonia pushed her away. "You'll never get it out like that," she said sharply. She gave my head a rough tousling and finished me off with something like a box in the ear. "Lena, you oughtn't try to wear those slippers anymore. They're too small for your feet. You'd better give them to me for Yulka." "All right," said Lena good-naturedly, tucking her white stockings under her skirt. "You get all Yulka's things, don't you?" "I wish Father didn't have such bad luck with his farm machinery. Then I could buy more things for my sisters. I'm going to get Mary a new coat for this fall, if the sulky plow is never paid for." Tiny asked why she didn't wait until after Christmas, when coats would be cheaper. "What do you think of poor me?" she added, "with 6 at home younger than I am. And they all think I'm rich, because when I go back to the country I'm dressed so fine." She shrugged her shoulders. "But, you know, my weakness is playthings. I like to buy them playthings better than what they need." "I know how that is," said Anna. "When we first came here, and I was little, we were too poor to buy toys. I never got over the loss of a doll somebody gave me before we left Norway. A boy on the boat broke her, and I still hate him for it." "I guess after you got here you had plenty of live dolls to nurse, like me," Lena remarked cynically. "Yes, the babies came along pretty fast, to be sure, but I never minded. I was fond of them all. The youngest one, that we didn't any of us want, is the one we love best now." Lena sighed. "Oh, the babies come all right. If only they don't come in winter. Ours nearly always did. I don't see how Mother stood it. I'll tell you what, girls," she sat up with sudden energy. "I'm going to get my mother out of that old sod house where she's lived so many years. The men will never do it. Johnny, that's my oldest brother, he's wanting to get married now and build a house for his girl instead of his mother. Mrs. Thomas says she thinks I can move to some other town pretty soon and go into business for myself. If I don't get into business, I'll maybe marry a rich gambler." "That would be a poor way to get on," said Anna sarcastically. I wish I could teach school, like Selma Crone. Just think. She'll be the first Scandinavian girl to get a position in the high school. We ought to be proud of her. Selma was a studious girl who had not much tolerance for giddy things like Tiny and Lena, but they always spoke of her with admiration. Tiny moved about restlessly, fanning herself with her straw hat. If I were smart like her, I'd be at my books day and night. But she was born smart, and look at how her father's trained her. He was something high up in the old country. So was my mother's father, murmured Lena, but that's all the good it does us. My father's father was smart too, but he was wild. He married a Lap. I guess that's what's the matter with me. They say my Lap blood will out. A real Lap, Lena? I exclaimed. The kind that wear skins? I don't know if she wore skins, but she was a Lap all right, and his folks felt dreadful about it. He was sent up north on some government job he had, and fell in love with her. He would marry her. But I thought Lapland women were fat and ugly, and had squint eyes like Chinese? I objected. I don't know, maybe. There must be something mighty taking about the Lap girls, though. My mother says the Norwegians up north are always afraid their boys will run after them. In the afternoon, when the heat was less oppressive, we had a lively game of Pussy Wants a Corner on the flat bluff top, with the little trees for bases. Lena was Pussy so often that she finally said she wouldn't play any more. We threw ourselves down on the grass, out of breath. Jim, Antonia said dreamily, I want you to tell the girls how the Spanish first came here, like you and Charlie Harling used to talk about. I've tried to tell them, but I leave out so much. They sat under a little oak, Tony resting against the trunk and the other girls leaning against her and each other, and listened to the little I was able to tell them about Coronado and his search for the 7 golden cities. At school we were taught that he had not got so far north as Nebraska, but had given up his quest and turned back somewhere in Kansas. But Charlie Harling and I had a strong belief that he had been along this very river. A farmer in the country north of ours, when he was breaking soil, had turned up a metal strip of fine workmanship and a sword with a Spanish inscription on the blade. He lent these relics to Mr. Harling, who brought them home with him. Charlie and I scoured them, and they were on exhibition in the Harling office all summer. Father Kelly, the priest, had found the name of the Spanish maker on the sword, and an abbreviation that stood for the city of Cordova. And that I saw with my own eyes, Antonia put in triumphantly. So Jim and Charlie were right, and the teachers were wrong. The girls began to wonder among themselves. Why had the Spaniards come so far? What must this country have been like then? Why had Coronado never gone back to Spain, to his riches and his castles and his king? I couldn't tell them. I only knew that Schoolbrook said he died in the wilderness of a broken heart. More than him has done that, said Antonia sadly, and the girls murmured assent. We sat looking off across the country, watching the sun go down. The curly grass about us was on fire now. The bark of the oaks turned red as copper. There was a shimmer of gold in the brown river. Out in the stream the sandbars glittered like glass, and the light trembled in the willow thickets, as if little flames were leaping among them. The breeze sank to stillness. In the ravine a ring-dove mourned plaintively, and somewhere off in the bushes an owl hooted. The girls sat listless, leaning against each other. The long fingers of the sun touched their foreheads. Presently we saw a curious thing. There were no clouds, and the sun was going down in a limpid, gold-washed sky. Just as the lower edge of the red disk rested on the high fields against the horizon, a great black figure suddenly appeared on the face of the sun. We sprang to our feet, straining our eyes towards it. In a moment we realized what it was. On some upland farm a plow had been left standing in the field. The sun was sinking just behind it. Magnified across the distance by the horizontal light, it stood out against the sun, was exactly contained within the circle of the disk, the handles, the tongue, the share, black against the molten red. There it was, heroic in size, a picture writing on the sun. Even while we whispered about it, our vision disappeared. The ball dropped and dropped until the red tip went beneath the earth. The fields below us were dark, the sky was growing pale, and that forgotten plow had sunk back into its own littleness somewhere on the prairie. End of Chapter 14. Recording by Nikki Sullivan, Chicago. Book 2, Chapter 15 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nikki Sullivan. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 2, The Hired Girls. Chapter 15. Late in August, the Cutters went to Omaha for a few days, leaving Antonia in charge of the house. Since the scandal about the Swedish girl, Willa Cather could never get his wife to stir out of Blackhawk without him. The day after the Cutters left, Antonia came over to see us. Grandmother noticed that she seemed troubled and distracted. "You've got something on your mind, Antonia," she said anxiously. "Yes, Mrs. Burden. I couldn't sleep much last night." She hesitated, and then told us how strangely Mr. Cutter had behaved before he went away. He put all the silver in a basket and placed it under her bed, and with it a box of papers which he told her was valuable. He made her promise that she would not sleep away from the house or be out late in the evening while he was gone. He strictly forbade her to ask any of the girls he knew to stay with her at night. She would be perfectly safe, he said, as he had just put a new Yale lock on the front door. Cutter had been so insistent in regard to these details that now she felt uncomfortable about staying there alone. She hadn't liked the way he kept coming into the kitchen to instruct her, or the way he looked at her. "I feel as if he's up to some of his tricks again, and is going to try to scare me, somehow." Grandmother was apprehensive at once. "I don't think it's right for you to stay there, feeling that way. I suppose it wouldn't be right for you to leave the place alone, either, and after giving your word. Maybe Jim would be willing to go over there and sleep, and you could come here nights. I'd feel safer, knowing you were under my own roof. I guess Jim could take care of the silver and old usury notes as well as you could." Antonia turned to me eagerly. "Oh, would you, Jim? I'd make up my bed nice and fresh for you. It's a real cool room, and the bed's right next to the window. I was afraid to leave the window open last night." I liked my own room, and didn't like the Cutters' house under any circumstances. But Tony looked so troubled that I consented to try this arrangement. I found that I slept there as well as anywhere, and when I got home in the morning, Tony had a good breakfast waiting for me. After prayers, she sat down at the table with us, and it was like old times in the country. The third night I spent at the Cutters, I awoke suddenly with the impression that I had heard a door open and shut. Everything was still, however, and I must have gone to sleep again immediately. The next thing I knew, I felt someone sit down on the edge of the bed. I was only half awake, but I decided that he might take the Cutter's silver, whoever he was. Perhaps I did not move. Perhaps if I did not move, he would find it and get out of there without troubling me. I held my breath and lay absolutely still. A hand closed softly on my shoulder, and at the same moment I felt something hairy and cologne-scented brushing my face. If the room had suddenly been flooded with electric light, I couldn't have seen more clearly the detestable bearded countenance that I knew was bending over me. I caught a handful of whiskers and pulled, shouting something. The hand that held my shoulder was instantly at my throat. The man became insane. He stood over me, choking me with one fist and beating me in the face with the other, hissing and chuckling and letting out a flood of abuse. "So this is what she's up to when I'm away, is it? Where is she, you nasty whelp? Where is she? Under the bed, are you, hussy? I know your tricks. Wait till I get at you. I'll fix this rat you've got in here. He's caught all right." So long as Cutter had me by the throat, there was no chance for me at all. I got hold of his thumb and bent it back until he let go with a yell. In a bound, I was on my feet and easily sent him sprawling to the floor. When I made a dive for the open window, struck the wire screen, knocked it out, and tumbled after it into the yard. Suddenly, I found myself running across the north end of Blackhawk in my nightshirt, just as someone finds oneself behaving in bad dreams. When I got home, I climbed in at the kitchen window. I was covered with blood from my nose and lip, but I was too sick to do anything about it. I found a shawl and an overcoat on the hat rack, lay down on the parlor sofa, and in spite of my hurts, went to sleep. My grandmother found me there in the morning. Her cry of fright awakened me. Truly, I was a battered object. As she helped me to my room, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My lip was cut and stood out like a snout. My nose looked like a big blue plum, and one eye was swollen shut and hideously discolored. Grandmother said we must have a doctor at once, but I implored her, as I had never begged for anything before, not to send for him. I could stand anything, I told her, so long as no one saw me or knew what had happened to me. I entreated her not to let grandfather even come into the room. She seemed to understand, though I was too faint and miserable to go into explanations. When she took off my nightshirt, she found some bruises on my chest and shoulders, and she began to cry. She spent the whole morning bathing and poulticing me, and rubbing me with arnica. I heard Antonia sobbing outside my door, but I asked grandmother to send her away. I felt that I never wanted to see her again. I hated her almost as much as I hated Cutter. She had let me in for all this disgustingness. Grandmother kept saying how thankful we ought to be that I had been there instead of Antonia. But I lay with my disfigured face to the wall and felt no particular gratitude. My one concern was that my grandmother should keep everyone away from me. If the story once got abroad, I would never hear the last of it. I could well imagine what the old man down at the drugstore would do with such a theme. While grandmother was trying to make me comfortable, grandfather went to the depot and learned that Willa Cather had come home on the night express from the east, and had left again on the 6 o'clock train for Denver that morning. The agent said his face was striped with court plaster, and he carried his left hand in a sling. He looked so used up that the agent asked him what had happened to him since 10 o'clock the night before, whereat Cutter began to swear at him and said he would have him discharged for incivility. That afternoon, while I was asleep, Antonia took grandmother with her and went over to the Cutters to pack her trunk. They found the place locked up, and they had to break the window to get into Antonia's bedroom. There, everything was in shocking disorder. Her clothes had been taken out of her closet, thrown into the middle of the room, and trampled and torn. My own garments had been treated so badly that I never saw them again. Grandmother burned them in the Cutter's kitchen range. While Antonia was packing her trunk and putting her room in order to leave it, the front doorbell rang violently. There stood Mrs. Cutter, locked out, for she had no key to the new lock, her head trembling with rage. I advised her to control herself, or she would have a stroke, grandmother said afterwards. Grandmother would not let her see Antonia at all, but made her sit down in the parlor, where she related to her just what had occurred the night before. Antonia was frightened, and was going home to stay for a while, she told Mrs. Cutter. It would be useless to interrogate the girl, for she knew nothing of what had happened. Then Mrs. Cutter told her story. She and her husband had started home from Omaha together the morning before. They had to stop over several hours at Waymore Junction to catch the Black Hawk train. During that wait, Cutter left her at the depot and went to the Waymore Bank to attend to some business. When he returned, he told her that he would have to stay overnight there, but she should go on home. He bought her ticket and put her on the train. She saw him slip a $20 bill into her handbag with her ticket. That bill, she said, should have aroused her suspicions at once, but did not. The trains are never called at little junction towns. Everybody knows when they come in. Mr. Cutter showed his wife's ticket to the conductor and settled her in her seat before the train moved off. It was not until nearly nightfall that she discovered that she was on the express bound for Kansas City, and that her ticket was made out to that point, and that Cutter must have planned it so. The conductor told her the Black Hawk train was due at Waymore 12 minutes after the Kansas City train left. She saw at once that her husband had played this trick in order to get back to Black Hawk without her. She had no choice but to go on to Kansas City and take the first fast train for home. Cutter could have got home a day earlier than his wife by any one of a dozen simpler devices. He could have left her in the Omaha hotel and said he was going to Chicago for a few days, but apparently it was part of his fun to outrage her feelings as much as possible. "Mr. Cutter will pay for this, Mrs. Burden. He will pay," Mrs. Cutter avowed, nodding her horse-like head and rolling her eyes. Grandmother said she hadn't a doubt of it. Certainly, Cutter liked to have his wife think him a devil. In some way, he depended upon the excitement he could arouse in her hysterical nature. Perhaps he got the feeling of being a rake more from his wife's rage and amazement than from any experiences of his own. His zest and debauchery might wane, but never Mrs. Cutter's belief in it. The reckoning with his wife at the end of an escapade was something he counted on, like the last powerful liquor of a long dinner. The one excitement he really couldn't do without was quarreling with Mrs. Cutter. End of chapter 15, recorded by Nikki Sullivan, Chicago.
Book 3, Elena Lingard, Chapter 1, of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Jeff Cowgill. My Antonia, by Willa Cather. Book 3, Elena Lingard, Chapter 1. At the university, I had the good fortune to come immediately under the influence of a brilliant and inspiring young scholar. Gaston Cleric had arrived in Lincoln only a few weeks earlier than I to begin his work as head of the Latin department. He came west at the suggestion of his physicians, his health having been enfeebled by a long illness in Italy. When I took my entrance examinations, he was my examiner, and my course was arranged under his supervision. I did not go home for my first summer vacation, but stayed in Lincoln, working off a year's Greek, which had been my only condition on entering the freshman class. Cleric's doctor advised against his going back to New England, and except for a few weeks in Colorado, he too was in Lincoln all that summer. We played tennis, read, and took long walks together. I shall always look back on that time of mental awakening as one of the happiest in my life. Gaston Cleric introduced me to the world of ideas. When one first enters that world, everything else fades for a time, and all that went before is as if it had not been. Yet I found curious survivals. Some of the figures of my old life seemed to be waiting for me in the new. In those days, there were many serious young men among the students who had come up to the university from the farms and the little towns scattered over the thinly settled state. Some of those boys came straight from the cornfields with only a summer's wages in their pockets, hung on through the 4 years, shabby and underfed, and completed the course by really heroic self-sacrifice. Our instructors were oddly assorted: wandering pioneer school teachers, stranded ministers of the gospel, a few enthusiastic young men just out of graduate schools. There was an atmosphere of endeavor, of expectancy and bright hopefulness about the young college that had lifted its head from the prairie only a few years before. Our personal life was as free as that of our instructors. There were no college dormitories. We lived where we could and as we could. I took rooms with an old couple, early settlers in Lincoln, who had married off their children and now lived quietly in their house at the edge of town, near the open country. The house was inconveniently situated for students, and on that account I got 2 rooms for the price of 1. My bedroom, originally a linen closet, was unheated and was barely large enough to contain my cot bed, and it enabled me to call the other room my study. The dresser and the great walnut wardrobe which held all my clothes, even my hats and shoes, I had pushed out of the way, and I considered them non-existent, as children eliminate incongruous objects when they are playing house. I worked at a commodious, green-topped table placed directly in front of the west window, which looked out over the prairie. In the corner at my right were all my books, in shelves I had made and painted myself. On the blank wall at my left, the dark, old-fashioned wallpaper was covered by a large map of ancient Rome, the work of some German scholar. Click had ordered it for me when he was sending for books from abroad. Over the bookcase hung a photograph of the tragic theater at Pompeii, which he had given me from his collection. When I sat at work, my half faced a deep, upholstered chair which stood at the end of my table, its high back against the wall. I had bought it with great care. My instructor sometimes looked in upon me when he was out for an evening tramp, and I noticed that he was more likely to linger and become talkative if I had a comfortable chair for him to sit in, and if he found a bottle of Benedictine and plenty of the kind of cigarettes he liked at his elbow. He was, I discovered, parsimonious about small expenditures, a trait absolutely inconsistent with his general character. Sometimes when he came, he was silent and moody, and after a few sarcastic remarks, he went away again to tramp the streets of Lincoln, which were almost as quiet and oppressively domestic as those of Black Hawk. Again, he would sit until nearly midnight, talking about Latin and English poetry, or telling me about his long stay in Italy. I can give no idea of the peculiar charm and vividness of his talk. In a crowd, he was nearly always silent. Even for his classroom, he had no platitudes, no stock of professorial anecdotes. When he was tired, his lectures were clouded, obscure, elliptical. But when he was interested, they were wonderful. I believe that Gaston Cleric narrowly missed being a great poet, and I have sometimes thought that his bursts of imaginative talk were fatal to his poetic gift. He squandered too much in the heat of personal communication. How often I have seen him draw his dark brows together, fix his eyes upon some object on the wall or a figure in the carpet, and then flash into the lamplight the very image that was in his brain. He could bring the drama of antique life before one out of the shadows, white figures against blue backgrounds. I shall never forget his face as it looked one night when he told me about the solitary day he spent among the sea temples that passed him, the soft wind blowing through the roofless columns, the birds flying low over the flowering marsh grasses, the changing lights on the silver cloud-hung mountains. He had willfully stayed the short summer night there, wrapped in his coat and rug, watching the constellations on their path down the sky until the bride of old Tithonus rose out of the sea, and the mountains stood sharp in the dawn. It was there he caught the fever which held him back on the eve of his departure for Greece, and of which he lay ill so long in Naples. He was still indeed doing penance for it. I remember vividly another evening when something led us to talk of Dante's veneration of Virgil. Cleric went through canto after canto of the Commedia, repeating the discourse between Dante and his sweet teacher, while his cigarette burned itself out unheeded between his long fingers. I can hear him now speaking the lines of the poet Statius, who spoke for Dante. I was famous on earth with the name which endures longest and honors most. The seeds of my ardor were the sparks from that divine flame whereby more than 1,000 have kindled. I speak of the Aeneid, mother to me and nurse to me in poetry. Although I admired scholarship so much in Cleric, I was not deceived about myself. I knew that I should never be a scholar. I could never lose myself for long among impersonal things. Mental excitement was apt to send me with a rush back to my own naked land and the figures scattered upon it. While I was in the very act of yearning toward the new forms that Cleric brought up before me, my mind plunged away from me, and I suddenly found myself thinking of the places and people of my own infinitesimal past. They stood up strengthened and simplified now, like the image of the plow against the sun. They were all I had for an answer to the new appeal. I begrudged the room that Jake and Otto and Russian Peter took up in my memory, which I wanted to crowd with other things. But whenever my consciousness was quickened, all those early friends were quickened within it, and in some strange way they accompanied me through all my new experiences. They were so much alive in me that I scarcely stopped to wonder whether they were alive anywhere else, or how. End of Chapter 1. Book number 3, Lena Lingard, Chapter 2 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Jeff Cowgill. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 3, Lena Lingard, Chapter 2. One March evening in my sophomore year, I was sitting alone in my room after supper. There had been a warm thaw all day, with mushy yards and little streams of dark water gurgling cheerfully into the streets out of old snowbanks. My window was open, and the earthy wind blowing through made me indolent. On the edge of the prairie, where the sun had gone down, the sky was turquoise blue like a lake, with gold light throbbing in it. Higher up, in the utter clarity of the western slope, the evening star hung like a lamp suspended by silver chains, like the lamp engraved upon the title page of old Latin texts, which is always appearing in new heavens and waking new desires in men. It reminded me, at any rate, to shut my window and light my wick in answer. I did so regretfully, and the dim objects in the room emerged from the shadows and took their place about me with the helpfulness which custom breeds. I propped my book open and stared listlessly at the page of the Georgics, where tomorrow's lesson began. It opened with the melancholy reflection that in the lives of mortals, the best days are the first to flee. Optima dies prima fugit. I turned back to the beginning of the third book, which we had read in class that morning. Primus ego in patriam mecum deducam musis. For I shall be the first, if I live, to bring the muse into my country. Cleric had explained to us that patria here meant not a nation or even a province, but the little rural neighborhood on the Manicchio where the poet was born. This was not a boast, but a hope, at once bold and devoutly humble, that he might bring the muse, but lately come to Italy from her cloudy Grecian mountains, not to the capital, the Palatia Romana, but to his own little country, to his father's fields, sloping down to the river and to the old beech trees with broken tops. Cleric said he thought Virgil, when he was dying at Brindisi, must have remembered that passage. After he had faced the bitter fact that he was to leave the Aeneid unfinished and had decreed that the great canvas, crowded with figures of gods and men, should be burned rather than survive him unperfected, then his mind must have gone back to the perfect utterance of the Georgics, where the pen was fitted to the matter as the plough is to the furrow, and he must have said to himself with the thankfulness of a good man, "I was the first to bring the muse into my country." We left the classroom quietly, conscious that we'd been brushed by the wing of a great feeling, though perhaps I alone knew Cleric intimately enough to guess what that feeling was. In the evening, as I sat staring at my book, the fervor of his voice stirred through the quantities on the page before me. I was wondering whether that particular rocky strip of New England coast about which he had so often told me was Cleric's patria. Before I had got far with my reading, I was disturbed by a knock. I hurried to the door, and when I opened it, saw a woman standing in the dark hall. "I expect you hardly know me, Jim." The voice seemed familiar, but I did not recognize her until she stepped into the light of the doorway, and I beheld Lena Lingard. She was so quietly conventionalized by city clothes that I might have passed her on the street without seeing her. Her black suit fitted her figure smoothly, and a black lace hat with pale blue forget-me-nots sat demurely on her yellow hair. I led her towards Cleric's chair, the only comfortable one I had, questioning her confusedly. She was not disconcerted by my embarrassment. She looked about her with the naive curiosity I remembered so well. "You're quite comfortable here, aren't you? I live in Lincoln now, too, Jim. I'm in business for myself. I have a dressmaking shop in the Raleigh block out on O Street. I made a real good start." "But, Lena, when did you come?" "Oh, I've been here all winter. Didn't your grandmother ever write you? I've thought about looking you up lots of times, but we've all heard what a studious young man you've got to be. I felt bashful. I didn't know whether you'd be glad to see me." She laughed her mellow, easy laugh that was either very artless or very comprehending. One never quite knew which. "You seem the same, though. Except you're a young man now, of course. Do you think I've changed?" "Maybe you're prettier. though you were always pretty enough. Perhaps it's your clothes that make a difference. You like my new suit? I have to dress pretty well in my business. She took off her jacket and sat more at ease in her blouse of some soft, flimsy silk. She was already at home in my place, had slipped quietly into it as she did into everything. She told me her business was going well and she had saved a little money. This summer, I'm going to build a house for Mother I've talked about so long. I won't be able to pay up on it at first, but I want her to have it before she's too old to enjoy it. Next summer, I'll take her down new furniture and carpets so she'll have something to look forward to all winter. I watched Lena sitting there, so smooth and sunny and well cared for, and thought of how she used to run barefoot over the prairie until after the snow began to fly, and how Crazy Mary chased her round and round the cornfields. It seemed to me wonderful that she should have got on so well in the world. Certainly she had no one but herself to thank for it. Well, you must feel proud of yourself, Lena, I said heartily. Look at me, I've never earned $1, and I don't know that I'll ever be able to. Tony says you're going to be richer than Mr. Harling someday. She's always bragging about you, you know. Tell me, how is Tony? She's fine. She works for Miss Gardner at the hotel now. She's housekeeper. Mrs. Gardner's health isn't what it was, and she can't see after everything like she used to. She has great confidence in Tony. Tony's made it up with the Harlings, too. Little Nina's so fond of her that Mrs. Harling kind of overlooked things. Is she still going with Larry Donovan? Oh, that's on worse than ever. I guess they're engaged. Tony talks about him like he was president of the railroad. Everybody laughs about it because she was never a girl to be soft. Oh, she won't hear a word against him. She's so sort of innocent. I said I didn't like Larry and never would. Lena's face dimpled. Some of us could tell her things, but it wouldn't do any good. She'd always believe him. That's Antonia's failing, you know. If she once likes people, she won't hear anything against them. I think I'd better go home and look after Antonia, I said. I think you had. Lena looked at me in frank amusement. It's a good thing the Harlings are friendly with her again. Larry's afraid of them. They ship so much grain they have influence with the railroad people. What are you studying? She leaned her elbows on the table and drew my book toward her. I caught a faint odor of violet sachet. So that's Latin, is it? It looks hard. You do go to the theater sometimes, though, for I've seen you there. Don't you just love a good play, Jim? No, I can't stay at home in the evening if there's one in town. I'd be willing to work like a slave, it seems to me, to live in a place where there are theaters. Well, let's go to a show together sometime. You're going to let me come and see you, aren't you? Would you like to? I'd be ever so pleased. I'm never busy after 6 o'clock, and I let my sewing girls go at 5:30. I board to save time, but sometimes I cook a chop for myself, and I'd be glad to cook one for you. Well, she began to put on her white gloves. It's been awful good to see you, Jim. Well, you needn't hurry, need you? You've hardly told me anything yet. We can talk when you come to see me. I expect you don't often have lady visitors. The old woman downstairs didn't want to let me come up very much. I told her I was from your hometown and had promised your grandmother to come and see you. How surprised Mrs. Burden would be. Lena laughed softly as she rose. When I caught up my hat, she shook her head. No, I don't want you to go with me. I'm to meet some Swedes at the drugstore. You wouldn't care for them. I wanted to see your room so I could write Tony all about it, but I must tell her how I left you right here with your books. She's always so afraid someone will run off with you. Lena slipped her silk sleeves into the jacket I held for her, smoothed it over her person, and buttoned it slowly. I walked with her to the door. Come and see me sometimes when you're lonesome. But maybe you have all the friends you want. Have you? She turned her soft cheek to me. Have you? She whispered teasingly in my ear. In a moment, I watched her fade down the dusky stairway. When I turned back to my room, the place seemed much pleasanter than before. Lena had left something warm and friendly in the lamplight. How I loved to hear her laugh again. It was so soft and unexcited and appreciative, gave a favorable interpretation to everything. When I closed my eyes, I could hear them all laughing. The Danish laundry girls and the 3 Bohemian Marys. Lena had brought them all back to me. It came over me as it had never done before, the relation between girls like those and the poetry of Virgil. If there were no girls like them in the world, there would be no poetry. I understood that clearly for the first time. This revelation seemed to me inestimably precious. I clung to it as if it might suddenly vanish. As I sat down to my book at last, my old dream about Lena coming across the harvest field in her short skirts seemed to me like the memory of an actual experience. It floated before me on the page like a picture, and underneath it stood the mournful line, Optima dies prima fugit. End of Chapter 2. Book 3, Lena Lingard, Chapter 3 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Jeff Cowgill. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 3, Lena Lingard, Chapter 3. In Lincoln, the best part of the theatrical season came late, when the good companies stopped off there for one-night stands after their long runs in New York and Chicago. That spring, Lena went with me to see Joseph Jefferson and Rip Van Winkle, and to a war play called Shenandoah. She was inflexible about paying for her own seat, said she was in business now and she wouldn't have a schoolboy spending his money on her. I liked to watch a play with Lena. Everything was wonderful to her, and everything was true. It was like going to revival meetings with someone who was always being converted. She handed her feelings over to the actors with a kind of fatalistic resignation. Accessories of costume and scene meant much more to her than to me. She sat entranced through Robin Hood and hung upon the lips of the contralto who sang, "Oh, Promise Me." Toward the end of April, the billboards, which I watched anxiously in those days, bloomed out one morning with gleaming white posters on which two names were impressively printed in blue Gothic letters. The name of an actress of whom I had often heard, and the name Camille. I called at the Raleigh block for Lena on Saturday evening, and we walked down to the theater. The weather was warm and sultry and put us both in a holiday humor. We arrived early because Lena liked to watch the people come in. There was a note on the program saying that the incidental music would be from the opera Traviata, which was made from the same story as the play. We had neither of us read the play, and we did not know what it was about, though I seem to remember having heard it was a piece in which great actresses shone. The Count of Monte Cristo, which I had seen James O'Neill play that winter, was by the only Alexandre Dumas I knew. This play I saw was by his son, and I expected a family resemblance. A couple of jackrabbits run in off the prairie could not have been more innocent of what awaited them than were Lena and I. Our excitement began with the rise of the curtain, when the moody Varville, seated before the fire, interrogated Nanine. Decidedly, there was a new tang about this dialogue. I had never heard in the theater lines that were alive, that presupposed and took for granted like those which passed between Varville and Marguerite in the brief encounter before her friends entered. This introduced the most brilliant, worldly, the most enchantingly gay scene I had ever looked upon. I had never seen champagne bottles opened on the stage before. Indeed, I had never seen them opened anywhere. The memory of that supper makes me hungry now. The sight of it then, when I had only students' boarding-house dinner behind me, was delicate torment. I seem to remember gilded chairs and tables, arranged hurriedly by footmen in white gloves and stockings, linen of dazzling whiteness, glittering glass silver dishes, a great bowl of fruit, and the reddest of roses. The room was invaded by beautiful women and dashing young men, laughing and talking together. The men were dressed more or less after the period in which the play was written. The women were not. I saw no inconsistency. Their talk seemed to open to one the brilliant world in which they lived. Every sentence made one older and wiser. Every pleasantry enlarged one's horizons. One could experience excess and satiety without the inconvenience of learning what to do with one's hands in a drawing room. When the characters all spoke at once and I missed some of the phrases they flashed at each other, I was in misery. I strained my ears and eyes to catch every exclamation. The actress who played Marguerite was even then old-fashioned, though historic. She had been a member of Daly's famous New York company, and afterward a star under his direction. She was a woman who could not be taught, it is said, though she had a crude natural force which carried with people whose feelings were accessible and whose taste was not squeamish. She was already old, with a ravaged countenance and a physique curiously hard and stiff. She moved with difficulty. I think she was lame. I seem to remember some story about a malady of the spine. Her Armand was disproportionately young and slight, a handsome youth, perplexed in the extreme. But what did it matter? I believed devoutly in her power to fascinate him, in her dazzling loveliness. I believed her young, ardent, reckless, disillusioned, under sentence, feverish, avid of pleasure. I wanted to cross the footlights and help the slim-waisted Armand in the frilled shirt to convince her that there was still loyalty and devotion in the world. Her sudden illness, when the gaiety was at its height, her pallor, the handkerchief she crushed against her lips, the cough she smothered under the laughter while Gaston kept playing the piano lightly, it all wrung my heart. But not so much as her cynicism in the long dialogue with her lover which followed. Oh, how far was I from questioning her unbelief. While the charmingly sincere young man pleaded with her, accompanied by the orchestra and the old Traviata duet Misterioso, Misterioso, she maintained her bitter skepticism, and the curtain fell on her dancing recklessly with the others after Armand had been sent away with his flower. Between the acts, we had no time to forget. The orchestra kept sawing away at the Traviata music, so joyous and sad, so thin and far away, so claptrap, and yet so heartbreaking. After the second act, I left Lena in tearful contemplation of the ceiling and went out into the lobby to smoke. As I walked about there, I congratulated myself that I had not brought some Lincoln girl who would talk during the waits about the junior dances, or whether the cadets would camp at Plattsmouth. Lena was at least a woman, and I was a man. Through the scene between Marguerite and the elder Duval, Lena wept unceasingly, and I sat helpless to prevent the closing of that chapter of idyllic love, dreading the return of the young man whose ineffable happiness was only to be the measure of his fall. I suppose no woman could have been further in person, voice, and temperament from Dumas' appealing heroine than the veteran actress who first acquainted me with her. Her conception of the character was as heavy and uncompromising as her diction. She bore hard on the idea and on the consonants. At all times she was highly tragic, devoured by remorse. Lightness of stress or behavior was far from her. Her voice was heavy and deep. "Armand," she would begin, as if she were summoning him to the bar of judgment. But the lines were enough. She had only to utter them. They created the character in spite of her. The heartless world which Marguerite re-entered with Varville had never been so glittering and reckless as on the night when it gathered at Olympe's salon for the fourth act. There were chandeliers hung from the ceiling. I remember many servants in livery, gaming tables where the men played with piles of gold, and a staircase down which the guests made their entrance. After all the others had gathered round the card tables and young Duval had been warned by Prudence, Marguerite descended the staircase with Varville. Such a cloak, such a fan, such jewels, and her face. One knew at a glance how it was with her. When Armand, with the terrible words, "Look, all of you, I owe this woman nothing," flung the golden banknotes at the half-swooning Marguerite, Lena cowered beside me and covered her face with her hands. The curtain rose on the bedroom scene. By this time there wasn't a nerve in me that hadn't been twisted. Nanine alone could have made me cry. I loved Nanine tenderly. And Gaston, how one clung to that good fellow. The New Year's presents were not too much. Nothing could be too much now. I wept unrestrainedly. Even the handkerchief in my breast pocket, worn for elegance and not at all for use, was wet through by the time that moribund woman sank for the last time into the arms of her lover. When we reached the door of the theater, the streets were shining with rain. I had prudently brought along Mrs. Harling's useful commencement present, and I took Lena home under its shelter. After leaving her, I walked slowly out into the country part of the town where I lived. The lilacs were all blooming in the yards, and the smell of them after the rain, of the new leaves and the blossoms together, blew into my face with a sort of bitter sweetness. I tramped through the puddles and under the showery trees, mourning for Marguerite Gauthier as if she had died only yesterday, sighing with the spirit of 1840, which had sighed so much, and which had reached me only that night, across long years and several languages, through the person of an infirm old actress. The idea is one that no circumstance can frustrate. Wherever and whenever that piece is put on, it is April. End of chapter 3. Book 3, Lena Lingard, Chapter 4, of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeff Cowgill. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 3, Lena Lingard, Chapter 4. How well I remember the stiff little parlor where I used to wait for Lena. The hard horsehair furniture, bought at some auction sale, the long mirror, the fashion plates on the wall. If I sat down even for a moment, I was sure to find threads and bits of colored silk clinging to my clothes after I went away. Lena's success puzzled me. She was so easygoing, had none of the push and self-assertiveness that get people ahead in business. She'd come to Lincoln a country girl with no introductions except as some cousin of Mrs. Thomas who lived there, and she was already making clothes for the women of the young married set. She evidently had great natural aptitude for her work. She knew, as she said, what people looked well in. She never tired of poring over fashion books. Sometimes in the evening I would find her alone in her workroom, draping folds of satin on a wire figure, with a quite blissful expression of countenance. I couldn't help thinking that the years when Lena literally hadn't enough clothes to cover herself might have something to do with her untiring interest in dressing the human figure. Her clients said that Lena had style, and overlooked her habitual inaccuracies. She never, I discovered, finished anything by the time she had promised, and she frequently spent more money on materials than her customer had authorized. Once, when I arrived at 6 o'clock, Lena was ushering out a fidgety mother and her awkward, overgrown daughter. The woman detained Lena at the door to say apologetically, "Well, you'll try to keep it under 50 for me, won't you, Miss Lingard? You see, she's really too young to come to an expensive dressmaker, but I knew you could do more with her than anybody else." "Oh, that would be all right, Mrs. Harron. I think we'll manage to get a good effect," Lena replied blandly. I thought her manner with her customers very good, and wondered where she had learned such self-possession. Sometimes after my morning classes were over, I used to encounter Lena downtown, in her velvet suit and a little black hat with a veil tied smoothly over her face, looking as fresh as a spring morning. Maybe she would be carrying home a bunch of jonquils or a hyacinth plant. When we passed a candy store, her footsteps would hesitate and linger. "Don't let me go in," she would murmur. "Get me by if you can." She was very fond of sweets and was afraid of growing too plump. We had delightful Sunday breakfasts together at Lena's. At the back of her long workroom was a bay window, large enough to hold a box couch and a reading table. We breakfasted in this recess after drawing the curtains that shut out the long room, with cutting tables and wire women and sheet-draped garments on the walls. The sunlight poured in, making everything on the table shine and glitter, and the flame of the alcohol lamp disappear altogether. Lena's curly black water spaniel, Prince, breakfasted with us. He sat beside her on the couch and behaved very well until the Polish violin teacher across the hall began to practice, when Prince would growl and sniff the air with disgust. Lena's landlord, old Colonel Raleigh, had given her the dog, and at first she was not at all pleased. She'd spent too much of her life taking care of animals to have much sentiment about them. But Prince was a knowing little beast, and she grew fond of him. After breakfast, I made him do his lessons, play dead dog, shake hands, stand up like a soldier. We used to put my cadet cap on his head. I had to take military drill at the university, and give him a yard measure to hold with his front leg. His gravity made us laugh immoderately. Lena's talk always amused me. Antonia had never talked like the people about her. Even after she learned to speak English readily, there was always something impulsive and foreign in her speech. But Lena had picked up all the conventional expressions she heard at Mrs. Thomas's dressmaking shop. Those formal phrases, the very flower of small-town proprieties, and the flat commonplaces, nearly all hypocritical in their origin, became very funny, very engaging, when they were uttered in Lena's soft voice, with her caressing intonations and arch naivete. Nothing could be more diverting than to hear Lena, who was almost as candid as nature, call a leg a limb, or a house a home. We used to linger a long while over our coffee in that sunny corner. Lena was never so pretty as in the morning. She wakened fresh with the world every day, and her eyes had a deeper color then, like the blue flowers that are never so blue as when they first open. I could sit idle all through a Sunday morning and look at her. Ole Benson's behavior was now no mystery to me. "There was never any harm in Ole," she once said. "People needn't have troubled themselves. He just liked to come over and sit on the draw side and forget about his bad luck. I like to have him. Any company's welcome when you're off with Carol all the time." "But wasn't he always glum?" I asked. "People said he never talked at all." "Sure he talked. In Norwegian. He'd been a sailor on an English boat and had seen a lot of queer places. He had wonderful tattoos. We used to sit and look at them for hours. There wasn't much to look at up there. He was like a picture book. He had a ship and a strawberry girl on one arm, and on the other a girl standing before a little house, with a fence and a gate and all, waiting for her sweetheart. Further up his arm, her sailor had come back and was kissing her. The sailor's return, he called it. I admitted it was no wonder Ole liked to look at a pretty girl once in a while with such a fright at home. "Well, you know," Lena said confidentially, "he married Mary because he thought she was strong-minded and would keep him straight. He never could keep straight on shore. The last time he landed in Liverpool, he'd been out on a 2 years' voyage. He was paid off one morning, and by the time he hadn't a cent left, and his watch and compass were gone. He'd got with some woman, and they'd taken everything. He worked his way up to his country on a little passenger boat. Mary was a stewardess, and she tried to convert him on the way over. He thought she was just the one to keep him steady. Poor Ole. Oh, he used to bring me candy from town hidden in his feed bag. He couldn't refuse anything to a girl. He'd have given away his tattoos long ago if he could. He's one of the people I'm sorriest for." If I happened to spend an evening with Lena and stayed late, the Polish violin teacher across the hall used to come out and watch me descend the stairs, muttering so threateningly that it would have been easy to fall into a quarrel with him. Lena had told him once that she liked to hear him practice, so he always left the door open and watched who came and went. There was a coolness between the Pole and Lena's landlord on her account. Old Colonel Raleigh had come to Lincoln from Kentucky and invested an inherited fortune in real estate at the time of inflated prices. Now he sat day after day in his office in the Raleigh block, trying to discover where his money had gone and how he could get some of it back. He was a widower and found very little congenial companionship in this casual western city. Lena's good looks and gentle manners appealed to him. He said her voice reminded him of Southern voices, and he found as many opportunities of hearing it as possible. He painted and papered her rooms for her that spring, and put in a porcelain bathtub in place of the tin one that had satisfied the former tenant. While these repairs were being made, the old gentleman often dropped in to consult Lena's preferences. She told me, with amusement, how Ordinsky, the Pole, had presented himself at her door one evening and said that if the landlord was annoying her by his attentions, he would promptly put a stop to it. "I don't exactly know what to do about him," she said, shaking her head. "He's so sort of wild all the time. I wouldn't like to have him say anything rough to that nice old man. The Colonel is long-winded, but then I expect he's lonesome. I don't think he cares much for Ordinsky either. He said once that if I had any complaints to make of my neighbors, I mustn't hesitate." One Saturday evening when I was having supper with Lena,
We heard a knock at her parlor door, and there stood the Pole, coatless, in a dress shirt and collar. Prince dropped on his paws and began to growl like a mastiff, while the visitor apologized, saying that he could not possibly come in thus attired, but he begged Lena to lend him some safety pins. "Oh, you'll have to come in, Mr. Ordinsky, and let me see what's the matter." She closed the door behind him. "Jim, won't you make Prince behave?" I rapped Prince on his nose, while Ordinsky explained that he had not had his dress clothes on for a long time, and tonight, when he was going to play for a concert, his waistcoat had split down the back. He thought he could pin it together until he got it to a tailor. Lena took him by the elbow and turned him round. She laughed when she saw the long gap in the satin. "Well, you can never pin that, Mr. Ordinsky. You've kept it folded too long, and the goods is all gone along the crease. Take it off. I can put a new piece of lining silk in there for you in 10 minutes. She disappeared into her workroom with the vest, leaving me to confront the Pole, who stood against the door like a wooden figure. He folded his arms and glared at me with his excitable, slanting brown eyes. His head was the shape of a chocolate drop and was covered with dry, straw-colored hair that fuzzed up about his pointed crown. He had never done more than mutter at me as I passed him, and I was surprised when he now addressed me. "Miss Lingard," he said haughtily, "is a young woman for whom I have the utmost respect." "So have I," said coldly. He paid no heed to my remark, but began to do rapid finger exercises on his shirt sleeves as he stood with tightly folded arms. "Kindness of heart," he went on, staring at the ceiling, "sentiment are not understood in a place like this. The noblest qualities are ridiculed. Grinning college boys, ignorant and conceited, what do they know of delicacy?" I controlled my features and tried to speak seriously. "Well, if you mean me, Mr. Ordinsky, I have known Miss Lingard a long time, and I think I appreciate her kindness. We come from the same town, and we grew up together." His gaze traveled slowly down from the ceiling and rested on me. "Am I to understand that you have this young woman's interests at heart, that you do not wish to compromise her?" "Well, that's a word we don't use much here, Mr. Ordinsky. A girl who makes her own living can ask a college boy to supper without being talked about. We take some things for granted." "Thus I have misjudged you, and ask your pardon." He bowed gravely. "Miss Lingard," he went on, "is an absolutely trustful heart. She has not learned the hard lessons of life. As for you and me, noblesse oblige." He watched me narrowly. Lena returned with the vest. "Come in and let us look at you as you go out, Mr. Ordinsky. I've never seen you in your dress suit," she said as she opened the door for him. A few moments later he reappeared with his violin case, a heavy muffler about his neck, and thick wooden gloves on his bony hands. Lena spoke encouragingly at him, and he went off with such an important professional air that we fell to laughing as soon as we had shut the door. "Poor fellow," Lena said indulgently. "He takes everything so hard." After that, Ordinsky was friendly to me, and behaved as if there was some deep understanding between us. He wrote a furious article attacking the musical taste of the town, and asked me to do him a great service by taking it to the editor of the morning paper. If the editor refused to print it, I was to tell him that he would be answerable to Ordinsky in person. He declared that he would never retract one word, and that he was quite prepared to lose all his pupils. In spite of the fact that nobody ever mentioned his article to him after it appeared, full of typographical errors which he thought intentional, he got a certain satisfaction from believing that the citizens of Lincoln had meekly accepted the epithet coarse barbarians. "You see how it is," he said to me. "Where there is no chivalry, there is no amour propre." When I met him on his rounds now, I thought he carried his head more disdainfully than ever, and strode up the steps of front porches and rang doorbells with more assurance. He told Lena he would never forget how I had stood by him when he was under fire. All this time, of course, I was drifting. Lena had broken up my serious mood. I wasn't interested in my classes. I played with Lena and Prince. I played with the Pole. I went buggy riding with the old colonel. who had taken a fancy to me and used to talk to me about Lena and the great beauties he had known in his youth. We were all three in love with Lena. Before the 1st of June, Gaston Cleric was offered an instructorship at Harvard College and accepted it. He suggested that I should follow him in the fall and complete my course at Harvard. He had found out about Lena, not from me, and he talked to me seriously. "You won't do anything here now. You should either quit school and go to work, or change your college and begin again in earnest. You won't recover yourself while you're playing about with this handsome Norwegian. Yes, I've seen her with you at the theater. She's very pretty, and perfectly irresponsible, I should judge." Cleric wrote my grandfather that he would like to take me east with him. To my astonishment, Grandfather replied that I might go if I wished. I was both glad and sorry on the day when the letter came. I stayed in my room all evening and thought things over. I even tried to persuade myself that I was standing in Lena's way. It is so necessary to be a little noble, and that if she had not me to play with, she would probably marry and secure her future. The next evening I went to call on Lena. I found her propped up on the couch in her bay window, with her foot in a big slipper. An awkward little Russian girl whom she had taken into her workroom had dropped a flat iron on Lena's toe. On the table beside her there was a basket of early summer flowers, which the Pole had left her after he heard of the accident. He always managed to know what went on in Lena's apartment. Lena was telling me some amusing piece of gossip about one of her clients when I interrupted her and picked up the flower basket. "Well, this old chap will be proposing to you someday, Lena." "Oh, he has. Often," she murmured. "What? After you've refused him?" "He doesn't mind that. It seems to cheer him to mention the subject. Old men are like that, you know. It makes them feel important to think they're in love with somebody." "The Colonel would marry you in a minute." "I hope you won't marry some old fellow, not even a rich one." Lena shifted her pillows and looked up at me in surprise. "Why, I'm not going to marry anybody. Didn't you know that?" "Nonsense, Lena. That's what girls say, but you know better. Every handsome girl like you marries, of course." She shook her head. "Not me." "But why not? What makes you say that?" I persisted. Lena laughed. "Well, it's mainly because I don't want a husband. Men are all right for friends, but as soon as you marry them, they turn into cranky old fathers, even the wild ones. They begin to tell you what's sensible and what's foolish, and want you to stick at home all the time. I prefer to be foolish when I feel like it, and be accountable to nobody." "But you'll be lonesome. You'll get tired of this sort of life, and you'll want a family." "Not me. I like to be lonesome. When I went to work for Mrs. Thomas, I was 19 years old, and I had never slept a night in my life when there weren't 3 in the bed. I never had a minute to myself except when I was off with the cattle." Usually, when Lena referred to her life in the country at all, she dismissed it with a single remark, humorous or mildly cynical. But tonight her mind seemed to dwell on those early years. She told me she couldn't remember a time when she was so little that she wasn't lugging a heavy baby about, helping to wash for babies, trying to keep their little chapped hands and faces clean. She remembered home as a place where there were always too many children, a cross man, and work piling up around a sick woman. "It wasn't Mother's fault. She would have made us comfortable if she could, but that was no life for a girl. After I began to herd and milk, I could never get the smell of the cattle off me. The few underclothes I had, I kept in a cracker box. On Saturday nights, after everybody was in bed, then I could take a bath if I wasn't too tired. I could make 2 trips to the windmill to carry water and heat it in the wash boiler on the stove. While the water was heating, I could bring in a wash tub out of the cave and take my bath in the kitchen. Then I could put on a clean nightgown and get into bed with 2 others who likely hadn't had a bath unless I'd given it to them. You can't tell me anything about family life. I've had plenty to last me." "But it's not all like that," I objected. "Near enough. It's all being under somebody's thumb. What's on your mind, Jim? Are you afraid I'll want you to marry me someday?" Then I told her I was going away. "What What makes you want to go away, Jim? Haven't I been nice to you? You've been just awfully good to me, Lena, I blurted. I don't think about much else. I never shall think about much else while I'm with you. I'll never settle down and grind if I stay here. You know that. I dropped down beside her and sat looking at the floor. I seemed to have forgotten all my reasonable explanations. Lena drew close to me, and the little hesitation in her voice that had hurt me was not there when she spoke again. I oughtn't to have begun it, ought I? She murmured. I oughtn't to have gone to see you that first time. But I did want to. I guess I've always been a little foolish about you. I don't know what first put it into my head unless it was Antonia, always telling me I mustn't be up to any of my nonsense with you. I let you alone for a long while, though, didn't I? She was a sweet creature to those she loved, that Lena Lingard. At last she sent me away with her soft, slow, renunciatory kiss. You aren't sorry I came to see you that time? She whispered. It seemed so natural. I used to think I'd like to be your first sweetheart. You were such a funny kid. She always kissed one as if she were sadly and wisely sending one away forever. We said many goodbyes before I left Lincoln, but she never tried to hinder me or hold me back. You're going, but you haven't gone yet, have you? She used to say. My Lincoln chapter closed abruptly. I went home to my grandparents for a few weeks, and afterward visited my relatives in Virginia until I joined a cleric in Boston. I was then 19 years old. End of chapter 4. End of book 3. Lena Lingard.
Book 4, Chapter 1 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 4. The Pioneer Woman's Story. Chapter 1. 2 years after I left Lincoln, I completed my academic course at Harvard. Before I entered the law school, I went home for the summer vacation. On the night of my arrival, Mrs. Harling and Frances and Sally came over to greet me. Everything seemed just as it used to be. My grandparents looked very little older. Frances Harling was married now, and she and her husband managed the Harling interests in Black Hawk. When we gathered in grandmother's parlor, I could hardly believe that I had been away at all. One subject, however, we avoided all evening. When I was walking home with Frances, after we had left Mrs. Harling at her gate, she said simply, You know, of course, about poor Antonia. Poor Antonia. Everyone would be saying that now, I thought bitterly. I replied that grandmother had written me how Antonia went away to marry Larry Donovan at some place where he was working, and that he had deserted her, and that there was now a baby. This was all I knew. He never married her, said Frances. I haven't seen her since she came back. She lives at home, on the farm, and almost never comes to town. She brought the baby in to show it to Mama once. I'm afraid she's settled down to be Ambrose's drudge for good. I tried to shut Antonia out of my mind. I was bitterly disappointed in her. I could not forgive her for becoming an object of pity. While Lena Lingard, for whom people had always foretold trouble, was now the leading dressmaker of Lincoln, much respected in Black Hawk. Lena gave her heart away when she felt like it, but she kept her head for business, and had got on in the world. Just then it was a fashion to speak indulgently of Lena and severely of Tiny Soderball, who had gone quietly west to try her fortune the year before. A Black Hawk boy, just back from Seattle, brought the news that Tiny had not gone to the coast on a venture, as she had allowed people to think, but with very definite plans. One of the roving promoters that used to stop at Mrs. Gardner's hotel owned idle property along the waterfront in Seattle, and he had offered to set Tiny up in business in one of his empty buildings. she was now conducting a sailor's lodging house. This, everyone said, would be the end of Tiny. Even if she had begun by running a decent place, she couldn't keep it up. All sailors' boarding houses were alike. When I thought about it, I discovered that I had never known Tiny as well as I knew the other girls. I remembered her tripping briskly about the dining room in her high heels, carrying a big tray full of dishes, glancing rather pertly at the spruce traveling men and contemptuously at the scrubby ones, who were so afraid of her that they didn't dare ask for 2 kinds of pie. Now it occurred to me that perhaps the sailors, too, might be afraid of Tiny. How astonished we would have been as we sat talking about her on Frances Harling's front porch, if we could have known what her future was really to be. Of all the girls and boys who grew up together in Black Hawk, Tiny Soderball was to lead the most adventurous life and to achieve the most solid worldly success. This is what actually happened to Tiny. While she was running her lodging house in Seattle, gold was discovered in Alaska. Miners and sailors came back from the north with wonderful stories and pouches of gold. Tiny saw it and weighed it in her hands. That daring, which nobody had ever suspected in her, awoke. She sold her business and set out for Circle City, in company with a carpenter and his wife, whom she had persuaded to go along with her. They reached Skagway in a snowstorm, went on dog sledges over the Chilcoot Pass, and shot the Yukon in flatboats. They reached Circle City on the very day when some Siwash Indians came into the settlement with the report that there had been a rich gold strike farther up the river, on a certain Klondike Creek. 2 days later, Tiny and her friends, and nearly everyone else in Circle City, started for the Klondike Fields, on the last steamer that went up the Yukon before it froze for the winter. That boatload of people founded Dawson City. Within a few weeks, there were 1,500 homeless men in camp. Tiny and the carpenter's wife began to cook for them, in a tent. The miners gave her a lot, and the carpenter put up a log hotel for her. There she sometimes fed 150 men a day. Miners came in on snowshoes from their placer claims 20 miles away to buy fresh bread from her, and paid for it in gold. That winter, Tiny kept in her hotel a Swede whose legs had been frozen one night in a storm when he was trying to find his way back to his cabin. The poor fellow thought it great fortune to be cared for by a woman, and a woman who spoke his own tongue. When he was told that his feet must be amputated, he said he hoped he would not get well. What could a working man do in this hard world without feet? He did in fact die from the operation, but not before he had deeded Tiny Soderball his claim on Hunker Creek. Tiny sold her hotel, invested half her money in Dawson building lots, and with the rest she developed her claim. She went off into the wilds and lived on it. She bought other claims from discouraged miners, traded or sold them on percentages. After nearly 10 years in the Klondike, Tiny returned, with a considerable fortune, to live in San Francisco. I met her in Salt Lake City in 1908. She was a thin, hard-faced woman, very well-dressed, very reserved in manner. Curiously enough, she reminded me of Mrs. Gardiner, for whom she had worked in Black Hawk so long ago. She told me about some of the desperate chances she had taken in the gold country, but the thrill of them was quite gone. She said frankly that nothing interested her much now but making money. The only 2 human beings of whom she spoke with any feeling were the Swede, Johnson, who had given her his claim, and Lena Lingard. She had persuaded Lena to come to San Francisco and to go into business there. Lincoln was never any place for her, Tiny remarked. In a town of that size, Lena would always be gossiped about. Frisco's the right field for her. She has a fine class of trade. Oh, she's just the same as she always was. She's careless, but she's level-headed. She's the only person I know who never gets any older. It's fine for me to have her there. Somebody who enjoys things like that. She keeps an eye on me and won't let me be shabby. When she thinks I need a new dress, she makes it and sends it home, with a bill that's long enough, I can tell you. Tiny limped slightly when she walked. The claim on Hunker Creek took toll from its possessors. Tiny had been caught in a sudden turn of weather, like poor Johnson. She lost 3 toes from one of those pretty little feet that used to trip about Black Hawk in pointed slippers and striped stockings. Tiny mentioned this mutilation quite casually, didn't seem sensitive about it. She was satisfied with her success, but not elated. She was like someone in whom the faculty for becoming interested is worn out. End of Chapter 1. Book 4, Chapter 2 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 4, The Pioneer Woman's Story. Chapter 2. Soon after I got home that summer, I persuaded my grandparents to have their photographs taken, and one morning I went to the photographer's shop to arrange for sittings. While I was waiting for him to come out of his developing room, I walked about, trying to recognize the likenesses on his walls. Girls in commencement dresses, country brides and grooms holding hands, family groups of 3 generations. I noticed, in a heavy frame, one of those depressing crayon enlargements often seen in farmhouse parlors, the subject being a round-eyed baby in short dresses. The photographer came out and gave a constrained, apologetic laugh. "That's Antonia Shimerda's baby. You remember her. She used to be the Harlings' Tony. Too bad. She seems proud of the baby, though. Wouldn't hear of a cheap frame for the picture. I expect her brother will be in for it Saturday." I went away feeling that I must see Antonia again. Another girl would have kept her baby out of sight, but Tony, of course, must have its picture on exhibition at the town photographer's, in a great gilt frame. How like her! I could forgive her, I told myself, if she hadn't thrown herself away on such a cheap sort of fellow. Larry Donovan was a passenger conductor, one of those train crew aristocrats who are always afraid that some one may ask them to put up a car window, and who, if requested to perform such a menial service, silently point to the button that calls the porter. Larry wore this air of official aloofness even on the street, where there were no car windows to compromise his dignity. At the end of his run he stepped indifferently from the train along with the passengers, his street hat on his head and his conductor's cap in an alligator-skin bag, went directly into the station and changed his clothes. It was a matter of the utmost importance to him never to be seen in his blue trousers away from the train. He was usually cold and distant with men, but with all women he had a silent, grave familiarity, a special handshake, accompanied by a significant, deliberate look. He took women, married or single, into his confidence, walked them up and down in the moonlight, telling them what a mistake he had made by not entering the office branch of the service, and how much better fitted he was to fill the post of general passenger agent in Denver than the rough-shod man who then bore that title. His unappreciated worth was the tender secret Larry shared with his sweethearts, and he was always able to make some foolish heart ache over it. As I drew near home that morning, I saw Mrs. Harling out in her yard, digging round her mountain ash tree. It was a dry summer, and she had now no boy to help her. Charlie was off in his battleship, cruising somewhere on the Caribbean Sea. I turned in at the gate. It was with a feeling of pleasure that I opened and shut the gate in those days. I liked the feel of it under my hand. I took the spade away from Mrs. Harling, and while I loosened the earth around the tree, she sat down on the steps and talked about the oriole family that had a nest in its branches. "Mrs. Harling," I said presently, "I wish I could find out exactly how Antonia's marriage fell through." "Why don't you go out and see your grandfather's tenant, the widow Stevens? She knows more about it than anybody else. She helped Antonia get ready to be married, and she was there when Antonia came back. She took care of her when the baby was born. She could tell you everything. Besides, the widow Stevens is a good talker, and she has a remarkable memory." End of Chapter 2. Book 4, Chapter 3 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 4, The Pioneer Woman's Story, Chapter 3. On the 1st or 2nd day of August, I got a horse and cart and set out for the high country to visit the widow Stevens. The wheat harvest was over, and here and there along the horizon I could see black puffs of smoke from the steam thrashing machines. The old pasture land was now being broken up into wheat fields and cornfields. The red grass was disappearing, and the whole face of the country was changing. There were wooden houses where the old sod dwellings used to be, and little orchards, and big red barns. All this meant happy children, contented women, and men who saw their lives coming to a fortunate issue. The windy springs and blazing summers, one after another, had enriched and mellowed that flat tableland. All the human effort that had gone into it was coming back in long sweeping lines of fertility. The changes seemed beautiful and harmonious to me. It was like watching the growth of a great man or of a great idea. I recognized every tree and sandbank and rugged draw. I found that I remembered the conformation of the land as one remembers the modeling of human faces. When I drew up to our old windmill, the widow Stevens came out to meet me. She was brown as an Indian woman, tall and very strong. When I was little, her massive head had always seemed to me like a Roman senator's. I told her at once why I had come. "You'll stay the night with us, Jimmy. I'll talk to you after supper. I can take more interest when my work is off my mind. You've no prejudice against a hot biscuit for supper. Some have these days." While I was putting my horse away, I heard a rooster squawking. I looked at my watch and sighed. It was 3 o'clock, and I knew that I must eat him at 6. After supper, Mrs. Stevens and I went upstairs to the old sitting-room, while her grave, silent brother remained in the basement to read his farm papers. All the windows were open. The white summer moon was shining outside. The windmill was pumping lazily in the light breeze. My hostess put the lamp on a stand in the corner and turned it low because of the heat. She sat down in her favorite rocking-chair and settled a little stool comfortably under her tired feet. "I'm troubled with calluses, Jim. Getting old," she sighed cheerfully. She crossed her hands in her lap and sat as if she were at a meeting of some kind. "Now, it's about that dear Antonia you want to know. Well, you've come to the right person. I've watched her like she'd been my own daughter. When she came home to do her sewing that summer, before she was to be married, she was over here about every day. They've never had a sewing machine at the Shimerdas, and she made all her things here. I taught her hem-stitching, and I helped her cut and fit. She used to sit here at that machine by the window, peddling the life out of it, she was so strong, and always singing them queer bohemian songs like she was the happiest thing in the world. 'Antonia,' I used to say, 'don't run that machine so fast, you won't hasten the day none that way.' Then she'd laugh and slow down for a little, but she'd soon forget and begin to pedal and sing again. I never saw a girl work harder to go to housekeeping right and well prepared. Lovely table linen the Harlings had given her, and Lena Lingard had sent her nice things from Lincoln. We hem-stitched all the tablecloths and pillowcases and some of the sheets. Old Mrs. Shimerda knit yards and yards of lace for her underclothes. Tony told me just how she meant to have everything in her house. She'd even bought silver spoons and forks and kept them in her trunk. She was always coaxing Brother to go to the post office. Her young man did write her real often, from the different towns along his run. The first thing that troubled her was when he wrote that his run had been changed, and they would likely have to live in Denver. "I'm a country girl," she said, "and I doubt if I'll be able to manage so well for him in a city. I was counting on keeping chickens, and maybe a cow." She soon cheered up, though. At last she got the letter telling her when to come. She was shaken by it. She broke the seal and read it in this room. I suspected then that she'd begun to get faint-hearted, waiting, though she'd never let me see it. Then there was a great time of packing. It was in March, if I remember rightly, and a terrible, muddy, raw spell with the roads bad for hauling her things to town. And here let me say, Ambrose did the right thing. He went to Black Hawk and bought her a set of plated silver in a purple velvet box, good enough for her station. He gave her $300 in money. I saw the check. He'd collected her wages all those first years she'd worked out, and it was but right. I shook him by the hand in this room. "You're behaving like a man, Ambrose," I said, "and I'm glad to see it, son." 'Twas a cold, raw day he drove her and her 3 trunks into Black Hawk to take the night train for Denver. The boxes had been shipped before. He stopped the wagon here, and she ran in to tell me good-bye. She threw her arms around me and kissed me and thanked me for all I'd done for her. She was so happy she was crying and laughing at the same time, and her red cheeks was all wet with rain. "You're surely handsome enough for any man," I said, looking at her. She laughed kind of flighty-like and whispered, "Goodbye, dear house," and then ran out into the wagon. I expect she meant for you and your grandmother as much as for me, so I'm particular to tell you. This house had always been a refuge to her. Well, in a few days we had a letter saying she had got to Denver safe, and he was there to meet her. They were to be married in a few days. He was trying to get his promotion before he married, she said. I didn't like that, but I said nothing. The next week Julka got a postcard saying she was well and happy. But after that we heard nothing. A month went by, and old Mrs. Shimerda began to get fretful. Ambrose was as sulky with me as if I'd picked out the man and arranged the match. One night, Brother William came in and said that on his way back from the fields he had passed a livery team from town driving fast, out the west road. There was a trunk on the front seat with the driver and another behind. In the back seat there was a woman all bundled up. But for all her veils, he thought 'twas Antonia Shimerda, or Antonia Donovan, as her name ought now to be. The next morning I got Brother to drive me over. I can walk still, but my feet ain't what they used to be, and I try to save myself. The lines outside the Shimerda's house was full of washing, though it was the middle of the week. As I got nearer, I saw a sight that made my heart sink. All those underclothes we'd put so much work on, out there swinging in the wind. Julka came bringing a dishpan full of wrung clothes, but she darted back into the house like she was loath to see us. When I went in, Antonia was standing over the tubs, just finishing up a big washing. Mrs. Shimerda was going about her work, talking and scolding to herself. She didn't so much as raise her eyes. Tony wiped her hand on her apron and held it out to me, looking at me steady but mournful. When I took her in my arms, she drew away. "Don't, Mrs. Stevens," she says. "You'll make me cry, and I don't want to." I whispered and asked her to come out of doors with me. I knew she couldn't talk free before her mother. She went out with me, bareheaded, and we walked up toward the garden. "I'm not married, Mrs. Stevens," she said to me, very quiet and natural-like, "and I ought to be." "Oh, my child," says I, "what happened to you? Don't be afraid to tell me." She sat down in the draw-side, out of sight of the house. "He's run away from me," she said. "I don't know if he ever meant to marry me." "You mean he's thrown up his job and quit the country?" says I. "He didn't have any job. He'd been fired, blacklisted for knocking down fares. I didn't know. I thought he hadn't been treated right. He was sick when I got there. He'd just come out of the hospital. He lived with me till my money gave out, and afterwards I found he hadn't really been hunting for work at all. Then he just didn't come back. One nice fellow up at the station told me, when I kept going up for him, to give it up. He said he was afraid Larry'd gone bad and wouldn't come back any more. I guess he's gone to old Mexico. The conductors get rich down there, collecting half fares off the natives and robbing the company. He was always talking to fellows who had got ahead that way." I asked her, of course, why she didn't insist on a civil marriage at once. That would have given her some hold on him. She leaned her head on her hands, poor child, and said, "I just don't know, Mrs. Stevens. I guess my patience was wore out waiting so long. I thought if he saw how well I could do for him, he'd want to stay with me. Jimmy, I sat down on that bank beside her and made lament. I cried like a young thing. I couldn't help it. I was just about heartbroke. It was one of them lovely warm May days, and the wind was blowing and the colts jumping around in the pastures, but I felt bowed with despair. My Antonia, that had so much good in her, had come home disgraced. And that Lena Lingard, who was always the bad one, say what you will, had turned out so well and was coming home here every summer in her silks and her satins and doing so much for her mother. I give credit where credit is due, but you know well enough, Jim Burden, that there is a great difference in the principles of those two girls. And here it was that the good one had come to grief. I was poor comfort to her. I marveled at her calm. As we went back to the house, she stopped to feel of her clothes to see if they was drying well, and seemed to take pride in their whiteness. She said she'd been living in a brick block where she didn't have proper conveniences to wash them. The next time I saw Antonia, she was out in the fields plowing corn. All that spring and summer she did the work of a man on the farm. It seemed to be an understood thing. Ambrose didn't get any other hand to help him. Poor Merrick had got violent and been sent away to an institution a good while back. I never saw any of Tony's pretty dresses. She didn't take him out of her trunks. She was quiet and steady. Folks respected her industry and tried to treat her as if nothing had happened. They talked, to be sure, but not like they would if she'd put on airs. She was so crushed and quiet that nobody seemed to want to humble her. She never went anywhere. All that summer she never once came to see me. At first I was hurt, but I got to feel that it was because this house reminded her of too much. I went over there when I could, but the times when she was in from the fields were the times when I was busiest here. She talked about the grain and the weather as if she'd never had another interest, and if I went over at night she always looked dead weary. She was afflicted with toothache, one tooth after another, ulcerated, and she went about with her face swollen half the time. She wouldn't go to Black Hawk to a dentist for fear of meeting people she knew. Ambrose had got over his good spell long ago, and was always surly. Once I told him he ought not to let Antonia work so hard and pull herself down. He said, "If you put that in her head, you better stay home." And after that I did. Antonia worked on through harvest and thrashing, though she was too modest to go out thrashing for the neighbors, like when she was young and free. I didn't see much of her until late that fall, when she had begun to herd Ambrose's cattle in the open ground north of here, up toward the big dog town. Sometimes she used to bring them over the west hill there, and I would run to meet her and walk north a piece with her. She had 30 cattle in her bunch. It had been dry, and the pasture was short, or she wouldn't have brought them so far. It was a fine open fall, and she liked to be alone. While the steers grazed, she used to sit on them grassy banks along the draws and sun herself for hours. Sometimes I slipped up to visit with her, when she hadn't gone too far. "It does seem like I ought to make lace or knit like Lena used to," she said one day. "But if I start to work, I look around and forget to go on. It seems like such a little while ago when Jim Burden and I was playing all over this country. Up here I can pick out the very places where my father used to stand. Sometimes I feel like I'm not going to live very long, so I'm just enjoying every day of this fall." After the winter begun, she wore a man's long overcoat and boots, and a man's felt hat with a wide brim. I used to watch her coming and going, and I could see that her steps were getting heavier. One day in December, the snow began to fall. Late in the afternoon, I saw Antonia driving her cattle homeward across the hill. The snow was flying round her, and she bent to face it, looking more lonesome-like to me than usual. "Dearie me," says I to myself, "the girl stayed out too late. It'll be dark before she gets them cattle put into the corral." I seemed to sense she'd been feeling too miserable to get up and drive them. That very night it happened. She got her cattle home, turned them into the corral, and went into the house, into her room behind the kitchen, and shut the door. There, without calling anybody, without a groan, she lay down on the bed and bore her child. I was lifting supper when Mrs. Shimerda came running down the basement stairs, out of breath and screeching. Baby come, she says. "Ambrose much like devil." Brother William was surely a patient man. He was just ready to sit down to a hot supper after a long day in the fields. Without a word, he rose and went down to the barn and hooked up his team. He got us over there as quick as it was humanly possible. I went right in and began to do for Antonia, but she laid there with her eyes shut and took no account of me. The old woman got a tubful of warm water to wash the baby. I overlooked what she was doing and said out loud, "Mrs. Shimerda, you don't put that strong yellow soap near the baby. You'll blister its little skin." I was indignant. "Mrs. Stevens," Antonia said from the bed, "if you'll look in the top tray of my trunk, you'll see some fine soap." That was the first word she spoke. After I'd dressed the baby, I took it out to show Ambrose. He was muttering behind the stove and wouldn't look at it. "You'd better put it in the rain barrel," he said. "Now see here, Ambrose," says I. "There's a law in this land, don't forget that. I stand here a witness that this baby has come into the world sound and strong, and I intend to keep an eye on what befalls it." I pride myself I cowed him. "Well, I expect you're not much interested in babies. But Antonia's got on fine. She loved it from the first as dearly as if she'd had a ring on her finger, and was never ashamed of it. It's 1 year and 8 months old now, and no baby was ever better cared for. Antonia is a natural-born mother. I wish she could marry and raise a family, but I don't know as there's much chance now." I slept that night in the room I used to have when I was a little boy, with the summer wind blowing in at the windows, bringing the smell of ripe fields. I lay awake and watched the moonlight shining over the barn and the stacks and the pond, and the windmill making its old dark shadow against the blue sky. End of Chapter 3. Book 4, Chapter 4 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 4, The Pioneer Woman's Story. Chapter 4. The next afternoon, I walked over to the Shimerdas. Julka showed me the baby and told me that Antonia was shocking wheat on the southwest quarter. I went down across the fields, and Tony saw me from a long way off. She stood still by her shocks, leaning on her pitchfork, watching me as I came. We met like people in the old song, in silence, if not in tears. Her warm hand clasped mine. "I thought you'd come, Jim. I heard you were at Mrs. Stevens last night. I've been looking for you all day." She was thinner than I had ever seen her, and looked, as Mrs. Stevens said, worked down. But there was a new kind of strength in the gravity of her face, and her color still gave her that look of deep-seated health and ardor. Still, why, it flashed across me that though so much had happened in her life and mine, she was barely 24 years old. Antonia stuck her pitchfork in the ground, and instinctively we walked toward that unplowed patch at the crossing of the roads, as the fittest place to talk to each other. We sat down outside the sagging wire fence that shut Mr. Shimerda's plot off from the rest of the world. The tall red grass had never been cut there. It had died down in winter, and come up again in spring, until it was as thick and shrubby as some tropical garden grass. I found myself telling her everything, why I had decided to study law and go into the law office of one of my mother's relatives in New York City, about Gaston Cleric's death from pneumonia last winter, and the difference it had made in my life. She wanted to know about my friends, and my way of living, and my dearest hopes. "Of course, it means you are going away from us for good," she said with a sigh, "but that don't mean I'll lose you. Look at my papa here. He's been dead all these years, and yet he is more real to me than almost anybody else. He never goes out of my life. I talk to him and consult him all the time. The older I grow, the better I know him, and the more I understand him." She asked me whether I had learned to like big cities. "I'd always be miserable in a city. I'd die of lonesomeness." I like to be where I know every stack and tree, and where all the ground is friendly. I want to live and die here. Father Kelly says everybody's put into this world for something, and I know what I've got to do. I'm going to see that my little girl has a better chance than I ever had. I'm going to take care of that girl, Jim. I told her I knew she would. Do you know, Antonia, since I've been away, I think of you more often than of anyone else from this part of the world. I'd have liked to have had you for a sweetheart, or a wife, or my mother, or my sister, anything that a woman can be to a man. The idea of you is a part of my mind. You influence my likes and dislikes, all my tastes, hundreds of times when I don't realize it. You really are a part of me. She turned her bright, believing eyes to me, and the tears came up in them slowly. How can it be like that? When you know so many people, and when I've disappointed you so? Ain't it wonderful, Jem, how much people can mean to each other? I'm so glad we had each other when we were little. I can't wait till my little girl is old enough to tell her about all the things we used to do. You'll always remember me when you think about the old times, won't you? And I guess everybody thinks about the old times, even the happiest people. As we walked homeward across the fields, the sun dropped and lay like a great golden globe in the low west. While it hung there, the moon rose in the east, as big as a cartwheel, pale silver and streaked with rose color, thin as a bubble or a ghost moon. For 5, perhaps 10 minutes, the two luminaries confronted each other across the level land, resting on opposite edges of the world. In that singular light, every tree and shock of wheat, every sunflower stalk and clump of snow on the mountain, drew itself up high and pointed. The very clods and furrows in the fields seemed to stand up sharply. I felt the old pull of the earth, the solemn magic that comes out of those fields at nightfall. I wished that I could be a little boy again, and that my way would end here. We reached the edge of the field where our ways parted. I took her hands and held them against my breast, feeling once more how strong and warm and good they were, those brown hands, and remembering how many kind things they had done for me. I held them now a long while over my heart. About us, it was growing darker and darker, and I had to look hard to see her face, which I meant always to carry with me, the closest, realest face, under all the shadows of women's faces, at the very bottom of my memory. "I'll come back," I said earnestly, through the soft, intrusive darkness. "Perhaps you will." I felt rather than saw her smile. "But even if you don't, you're here, like my father, so I won't be lonesome." As I went back alone over that familiar road, I could almost believe that a boy and a girl ran alongside me, as our shadows used to do, laughing and whispering to each other in the grass. End of Chapter 4.
Book 5, Chapter 1 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 5, Cusick's Boys. Chapter 1. I told Antonia I would come back, but life intervened, and it was 20 years before I kept my promise. I heard of her from time to time, that she married, very soon after I last saw her, a young Bohemian, a cousin of Antonia Shimerda, that they were poor, and had a large family. Once, when I was abroad, I went into Bohemia, and from Prague I sent Antonia some photographs of her native village. Months afterward came a letter from her, telling me the names and ages of her many children, but little else, signed, "Your old friend, Antonia Cusick." When I met Tiny Soderball in Salt Lake, she told me that Antonia had not done very well, that her husband was not a man of much force, and she had had a hard life. Perhaps it was cowardice that kept me away so long. My business took me west several times every year, and it was always in the back of my mind that I would stop in Nebraska some day and go to see Antonia. but I kept putting it off until the next trip. I did not want to find her aged and broken. I really dreaded it. In the course of 20 crowded years one parts with many illusions. I did not wish to lose the early ones. Some memories are realities, and are better than anything that can ever happen to one again. I owe it to Lena Lingard that I went to see Antonia at last. I was in San Francisco 2 summers ago, when both Lena and Tiny Soderball were in town. Tiny lives in a house of her own, and Lena's shop is in an apartment house just around the corner. It interested me, after so many years, to see the 2 women together. Tiny audits Lena's accounts occasionally, and invests her money for her, and Lena, apparently, takes care that Tiny doesn't grow too miserly. "If there's anything I can't stand," she said to me in Tiny's presence, "it's a shabby rich woman." Tiny smiled grimly and assured me that Lena would never be either shabby or rich. "And I don't want to be," the other agreed complacently. Lena gave me a cheerful account of Antonia and urged me to make her a visit. "You really ought to go, Jim. It would be such a satisfaction to her. Never mind what Tiny says. There's nothing the matter with Cusick. You'd like him. He isn't a hustler, but a rough man would never have suited Tony. Tony has nice children, 10 or 11 of them by this time, I guess. I shouldn't care for a family of that size myself, but somehow it's just right for Tony. She'd love to show them to you." On my way east I broke my journey at Hastings in Nebraska, and set off with an open buggy and a fairly good livery team to find the Cusick farm. At a little past midday, I knew I must be nearing my destination. Set back on a swell of land at my right, I saw a wide farmhouse, with a red barn and an ash grove, and cattle yards in front that sloped down to the high road. I drew up my horses and was wondering whether I should drive in here when I heard low voices. Ahead of me, in the plum thicket beside the road, I saw 2 boys bending over a dead dog. The little one, not more than 4 or 5, was on his knees, his hands folded, and his close-clipped, bare head drooping forward in deep dejection. The other stood beside him, a hand on his shoulder, and was comforting him in a language I had not heard for a long while. When I stopped my horses opposite them, the older boy took his brother by the hand and came toward me. He, too, looked grave. This was evidently a sad afternoon for them. "Are you Mrs. Cusick's boys?" I asked. The younger one did not look up. He was submerged in his own feelings, but his brother met me with intelligent gray eyes. "Yes, sir." "Does she live up there on the hill? I am going to see her. Get in and ride up with me." He glanced at his reluctant little brother. "I guess we'd better walk, but we'll open the gate for you." I drove along the side road, and they followed slowly behind. When I pulled up at the windmill, another boy, barefooted and curly-headed, ran out of the barn to tie my team for me. He was a handsome one, this chap, fair-skinned and freckled, with red cheeks and a ruddy pelt as thick as a lamb's wool, growing down on his neck in little tufts. He tied my team with 2 flourishes of his hands, and nodded when I asked him if his mother was at home. As he glanced at me, his face dimpled with a seizure of irrelevant merriment, and he shot up the windmill tower with a lightness that struck me as disdainful. I knew he was peering down at me as I walked toward the house. Ducks and geese ran quacking across my path. White cats were sunning themselves among yellow pumpkins on the porch steps. I looked through the wire screen into a big, light kitchen with a white floor. I saw a long table, rows of wooden chairs against the wall, and a shining range in one corner. 2 girls were washing dishes at the sink, laughing and chattering, and a little one in a short pinafore sat on a stool playing with a rag baby. When I asked for their mother, one of the girls dropped her towel, ran across the floor with noiseless bare feet, and disappeared. The older one, who wore shoes and stockings, came to the door to admit me. She was a buxom girl with dark hair and eyes, calm and self-possessed. "Won't you come in? Mother will be here in a minute." Before I could sit down in the chair she offered me, the miracle happened. One of those quiet moments that clutch the heart, and take more courage than the noisy, excited passages in life. Antonia came in and stood before me, a stalwart, brown woman, flat-chested, her curly brown hair a little grizzled. It was a shock, of course. It always is, to meet people after long years, especially if they have lived as much and as hard as this woman had. We stood looking at each other. The eyes that peered anxiously at me were simply Antonia's eyes. I had seen no others like them since I looked into them last, though I had looked at so many thousands of human faces. As I confronted her, the changes grew less apparent to me, her identity stronger. She was there, in the full vigor of her personality, battered but not diminished, looking at me, speaking to me in the husky, breathy voice I remembered so well. "My husband's not at home, sir. Can I do anything?" "Don't you remember me, Antonia? Have I changed so much?" She frowned into the slanting sunlight that made her brown hair look redder than it was. Suddenly her eyes widened, her whole face seemed to grow broader. She caught her breath and put out two hard-worked hands. "Why, it's Jim! Anna! Yulka! It's Jim Burden!" She had no sooner caught my hands than she looked alarmed. "What's happened? Is anybody dead?" I patted her arm. "No, I didn't come to a funeral this time. I got off the train at Hastings and drove down to see you and your family." She dropped my hand and began rushing about. "Anton, Yulka, Nina, where are you all? Run, Anna, and hunt for the boys. They're off looking for that dog somewhere. And call Leo. Where is that Leo?" She pulled them out of corners and came bringing them like a mother cat, bringing in her kittens. "You don't have to go right off, Jim. My oldest boy's not here. He's gone with his papa to the street fair at Wilbur. I won't let you go. You've got to stay and see Rudolph and our papa." She looked at me imploringly, panting with excitement. While I reassured her and told her there would be plenty of time, the barefooted boys from outside were slipping into the kitchen and gathering about her. "Now, tell me their names and how old they are." As she told them off in turn, she made several mistakes about ages, and they roared with laughter. When she came to my light-footed friend of the windmill, she said, "This is Leo, and he's old enough to be better than he is." He ran up to her and butted her playfully with his curly head, like a little ram, but his voice was quite desperate. "You forgot. You always forget mine. It's mean. Please tell him, Mother." He clenched his fists in vexation and looked up at her impetuously. She wound her forefinger in his yellow fleece and pulled it, watching him. "Well, how old are you?" "I'm 12, he panted, looking not at me but at her. "I'm 12 years old, and I was born on Easter Day." She nodded to me. "It's true, he was an Easter baby." The children all looked at me as if they expected me to exhibit astonishment or delight at this information. Clearly they were proud of each other, and of being so many. When they had all been introduced, Anna, the eldest daughter, who had met me at the door, scattered them gently, and came bringing a white apron, which she tied round her mother's waist. "Now, Mother, sit down and talk to Mr. Burden. We'll finish the dishes quietly and not disturb you." Antonia looked about, quite distracted. "Yes, child, but why don't we take him into the parlor, now that we've got a nice parlor for company?" The daughter laughed indulgently, and took my hat from me. "Well, you're here now, Mother, and if you talk here, Yulka and I can listen too. You can show him the parlor after a while." She smiled at me and went back to the dishes with her sister. The little girl with the rag doll found a place on the bottom step of an enclosed back stairway, and sat with her toes curled up, looking out at us expectantly. "She's Nina, after Nina Harling," Antonia explained. "Ain't her eyes like Nina's? I declare, Jim, I loved you children almost as much as I love my own. These children know all about you, and Charlie and Sally, like as if they'd grown up with you. I can't think of what I want to say, you've got me so stirred up. And then I forgot my English so. I don't often talk it any more. I tell the children I used to speak real well." She said they always spoke Bohemian at home. The little ones could not speak English at all, didn't learn it until they went to school. "I can't believe it's you, sitting here in my own kitchen. You wouldn't have known me, would you, Jim? You've kept so young yourself, but it's easier for a man. I can't see how my Anton looks any older than the day I married him. His teeth have kept so nice. I haven't got many left, but I feel just as young as I used to, and I can do as much work. Oh, we don't have to work so hard now. We've got plenty to help us, Papa and me. And how many have you got, Jim?" When I told her I had no children, she seemed embarrassed. "Oh, ain't that too bad? Maybe you could take one of my bad ones now. That Leo, he's the worst of all." She leaned toward me with a smile. "And I love him the best," she whispered. "Mother," the two girls murmured reproachfully from the dishes. Antonia threw up her head and laughed. "I can't help it. You know I do. Maybe it's because he came on Easter Day. I don't know. And he's never out of mischief 1 minute." I was thinking, as I watched her, how little it mattered. About her teeth, for instance. I know so many women who have kept all the things that she had lost, but whose inner glow has faded. Whatever else was gone, Antonia had not lost the fire of life. Her skin, so brown and hardened, had not that look of flabbiness, as if the sap beneath it had been secretly drawn away. While we were talking, the little boy whom they called Jan came in and sat down on the step beside Nina, under the hood of the stairway. He wore a funny long gingham apron, like a smock, over his trousers, and his hair was clipped so short that his head looked white and naked. He watched us out of his big, sorrowful gray eyes. "He wants to tell you about the dog, Mother. They found it dead," Anna said as she passed us on her way to the cupboard. Antonia beckoned the boy to her. He stood by her chair, leaning his elbows on her knees and twisting her apron strings in his slender fingers, while he told her his story softly in Bohemian, and the tears brimmed over and hung on his long lashes. His mother listened, spoke soothingly to him, and in a whisper promised him something that made him give her a quick, teary smile. He slipped away and whispered his secret to Nina, sitting close to her and talking behind his hand. When Anna finished her work and had washed her hands, she came and stood behind her mother's chair. "Why don't we show Mr. Burton our new fruit cave?" she asked. We started off across the yard with the children at our heels. The boys were standing by the windmill, talking about the dog. Some of them ran ahead to open the cellar door. When we descended, they all came down after us, and seemed quite as proud of the cave as the girls were. Ambrose, the thoughtful-looking one, who had directed me down by the plum bushes, called my attention to the stout brick walls and the cement floor. "Yes, it is a good way from the house," he admitted, "but you see, in winter there are nearly always some of us around to come out and get things." Anna and Yulka showed me 3 small barrels, one full of dill pickles, one full of chopped pickles, and one full of pickled watermelon rinds. "You wouldn't believe, Jim, what it takes to feed them all," their mother exclaimed. "You ought to see the bread we bake on Wednesdays and Saturdays. It's no wonder their poor papa can't get rich. He has to buy so much sugar for us to preserve with. We have our own wheat ground for flour, but then there's that much less to sell." Nina and Jan and a little girl named Lucy kept shyly pointing out to me the shelves of glass jars. They said nothing, but glanced at me, traced on the glass with their fingertips the outline of the cherries and strawberries and crab-apples within, trying by a blissful expression of countenance to give me some idea of their deliciousness. "Show him the spiced plums, Mother. Americans don't have those," said one of the older boys. "Mother uses them to make kolaches," he added. Leo, in a low voice, tossed off some scornful remark in Bohemian. I turned to him. "You don't think I know what kolaches are, eh? You're mistaken, young man. I've eaten your mother's kolaches long before that Easter day when you were born." "Always too fresh, Leo," Ambrose remarked with a shrug. Leo dived behind his mother and grinned out at me. We turned to leave the cave. Antonia and I went up the stairs first, and the children waited. We were standing outside talking when they all came running up the steps together, big and little, tow-heads and gold-heads in brown, and flashing little naked legs, a veritable explosion of life out of the dark cave into the sunlight. It made me dizzy for a moment. The boys escorted us to the front of the house, which I hadn't yet seen. In farmhouses, somehow, life comes and goes by the back door. The roof was so steep that the eaves were not much above the forest of tall hollyhocks, now brown and in seed. Through July, Antonia said, the house was buried in them. The Bohemians, I remembered, always planted hollyhocks. The front yard was enclosed by a thorny locust hedge, and at the gate grew 2 silvery, moth-like trees of the mimosa family. From here one looked down over the cattle yards, with their 2 long ponds, and over a wide stretch of stubble which they told me was a rye field in summer. At some distance behind the house were an ash grove and 2 orchards, a cherry orchard with gooseberry and currant bushes between the rows, and an apple orchard, sheltered by a high hedge from the hot winds. The older children turned back when we reached the hedge, but Jan and Nina and Lucy crept through it by a hole known only to themselves, and hid under the low branching mulberry bushes. As we walked through the apple orchard, grown up in tall bluegrass, Antonia kept stopping to tell me about one tree and another. "I love them as if they were people," she said, rubbing her hands over the bark. "There wasn't a tree here when we first came. We planted every one, and used to carry water for them, too, after we'd been working in the fields all day. Anton, he was a city man, and he used to get discouraged. but I couldn't feel so tired that I wouldn't fret about those trees when there was a dry time. They were on my mind like children. Many a night after he was asleep I've got up and come out and carried water to the poor things. And now, you see, we have the good of them. My man worked in the orange groves in Florida, and he knows all about grafting. There ain't one of our neighbors has an orchard that bears like ours. In the middle of the orchard we came upon a grape arbor with seats built along the sides and a warped plank table. The 3 children were waiting for us there. They looked up at me bashfully and made some request of their mother. They want me to tell you how the teacher has the school picnic here every year. These don't go to school yet, so they think it's all like the picnic. After I had admired the arbor sufficiently, the youngsters ran away to an open place where there was a rough jungle of French pinks, and squatted down among them, crawling about and measuring with a string. Jan wants to bury his dog there, Antonia explained. I had to tell him he could. He's kind of like Nina Harling. You remember how hard she used to take little things? He has funny notions like her. We sat down and watched them. Antonia leaned her elbows on the table. There was the deepest peace in that orchard. It was surrounded by a triple enclosure, the wire fence, then the hedge of thorny locusts, then the mulberry hedge which kept out the hot winds of summer and held fast to the protecting snows of winter. The hedges were so tall that we could see nothing but the blue sky above them, neither the barn roof nor the windmill. The afternoon sun poured down on us through the drying grape leaves. The orchard seemed full of sun, like a cup, and we could smell the ripe apples on the trees. The crabs hung on the branches as thick as beads on a string, purple-red, with a thin silvery glaze over them. Some hens and ducks had crept through the hedge and were pecking at the fallen apples. The drakes were handsome fellows, with pinkish-grey bodies, their heads and necks covered with iridescent green feathers which grew close and full, changing to blue like a peacock's neck. Antonia said they always reminded her of soldiers, some uniform she had seen in the old country when she was a child. "Are there any quail left now?" I asked. I reminded her how she used to go hunting with me the last summer before we moved to town. "You weren't a bad shot, Tony. Do you remember how you used to want to run away and go for ducks with Charlie Harling and me?" "I know, but I'm afraid to look at a gun now." She picked up one of the drakes and ruffled his green capote with her fingers. "Ever since I've had children, I don't like to kill anything. It makes me kind of faint to wring an old goose's neck. Ain't that strange, Jim?" "I don't know. The young Queen of Italy said the same thing once to a friend of mine. She used to be a great huntswoman, but now she feels as you do, and only shoots clay pigeons." "Then I'm sure she's a good mother," Antonia said warmly. She told me how she and her husband had come out to this new country when the farmland was cheap and could be had on easy payments. The first 10 years were a hard struggle. Her husband knew very little about farming and often grew discouraged. "We'd never have got through if I hadn't been so strong. I've always had good health, thank God, and I was able to help him in the fields until right up to the time before my babies came. Our children were good about taking care of each other. Martha, the one you saw when she was a baby, was such a help to me, and she trained Anna to be just like her. My Martha's married now, and has a baby of her own. Think of that, Jim!" "No, I never got downhearted. Anton's a good man, and I loved my children and always believed they would turn out well. I belong on a farm. I'm never lonesome here like I used to be in town. You remember what sad spells I used to have when I didn't know what was the matter with me? I've never had them out here, and I don't mind work a bit if I don't have to put up with sadness." She leaned her chin on her hand and looked down through the orchard, where the sunlight was growing more and more golden. "You ought never have gone to town, Tony," I said, wondering at her. She turned to me eagerly. "Oh, I'm glad I went. I'd never have known anything about cooking or housekeeping if I hadn't. I learned nice ways at the Harlings, and I've been able to bring my children up so much better. Don't you think they are pretty well behaved for country children? If it hadn't been for what Mrs. Harling taught me, I expect I'd have brought them up like wild rabbits. Now, I'm glad I had a chance to learn, but I'm thankful none of my daughters will ever have to work out. The trouble with me was, Jim, I never could believe harm of anybody I loved." While we were talking, Antonia assured me that she could keep me for the night. "We've plenty of room. 2 of the boys sleep in the haymow till cold weather comes, but there's no need for it. Leo always begs to sleep there, and Ambrose goes along to look after him." I told her I would like to sleep in the haymow with the boys. "You can do just as you want to. The chest is full of clean blankets put away for winter. Now I must go or my girls will be doing all the work, and I want to cook your supper myself." As we went toward the house, we met Ambrose and Anton, starting off with their milking pails to hunt the cows. I joined them, and Leo accompanied us at some distance, running ahead and starting up at us out of clumps of ironweed, calling, "I'm a jackrabbit!" or "I'm a big bull snake!" I walked between the two older boys, straight, well-made fellows with good heads and clear eyes. They talked about their school and their new teacher, told me about the crops and the harvest, and how many steers they would feed that winter. They were easy and confidential with me, as if I were an old friend of the family, and not too old. I felt like a boy in their company, and all manner of forgotten interests revived in me. It seemed, after all, so natural to be walking along a barbed wire fence beside the sunset, toward a red pond, and to see my shadow moving along at my right, over the close-cropped grass. "Has Mother shown you the pictures you sent her from the old country?" Ambrose asked. "We've had them framed, and they're hung up in the parlor. She was so glad to get them. I don't believe I ever saw her so pleased about anything." There was a note of simple gratitude in his voice that made me wish I had given more occasion for it. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Your mother, you know, was very much loved by all of us. She was a beautiful girl." "Oh, we know." They both spoke together, seemed a little surprised that I should think it necessary to mention this. "Everybody liked her, didn't they? The Harlings and your grandmother, and all the town people." "Sometimes," I ventured, "it doesn't occur to boys that their mother was ever young and pretty." "Oh, we know," they said again warmly. "She's not very old now," Ambrose added. "Not much older than you." "Well," I said, "if you weren't nice to her, I think I'd take a club and go for the whole lot of you. I couldn't stand it if you boys were inconsiderate, or thought of her as if she were just somebody who looked after you. You see, I was very much in love with your mother once, and I know there's nobody like her." The boys laughed and seemed pleased and embarrassed. "She never told us that," said Anton, "but she's always talked lots about you, and about what good times you used to have. She has a picture of you that she cut out of the Chicago paper once, and Leo says he recognized you when you drove up to the windmill. You can't tell about Leo, though. Sometimes he likes to be smart." We brought the cows home to the corner nearest the barn, and the boys milked them while the night came on. Everything was as it should be, the strong smell of sunflowers and ironweed in the dew, the clear blue and gold of the sky, the evening star, the purr of the milk into the pails, the grunts and squeals of the pigs fighting over their supper. I began to feel the loneliness of the farm boy at evening, when the chores seem everlastingly the same, and the world so far away. What a tableful we were at supper! 2 long rows of restless heads in the lamplight, and so many eyes fastened excitedly upon Antonia as she sat at the head of the table, filling the plates and starting the dishes on their way. The children were seated according to a system, a little one next to an older one, who was to watch over his behavior and see that he got his food. Anna and Yulka left their chairs from time to time to bring fresh plates of kolaches and pitchers of milk. After supper we went into the parlor, so that Yulka and Leo could play for me. Antonia went first, carrying the lamp. There were not nearly chairs enough to go round, so the younger children sat down on the bare floor. Little Lucy whispered to me that they were going to have a parlor carpet if they got 90 cents for their wheat. Leo, with a good deal of fussing, got out his violin. It was old Mr. Shimerda's instrument, which Antonia had always kept, and it was too big for him. But he played very well for a self-taught boy. Poor Yulka's efforts were not so successful. While they were playing, little Nina got up from her corner, came out into the middle of the floor, and began to do a pretty little dance on the boards with her bare feet. No one paid the least attention to her, and when she was through she stole back and sat down by her brother. Antonia spoke to Leo in Bohemian. He frowned and wrinkled up his face. He seemed to be trying to pout, but his attempt only brought out dimples in unusual places. After twisting and screwing the keys, he played some Bohemian airs, without the organ to hold him back, and that went better. The boy was so restless that I had not had a chance to look at his face before. My first impression was right. He really was fawn-like. He hadn't much head behind his ears, and his tawny fleece grew down thick to the back of his neck. His eyes were not frank and wide apart like those of the other boys, but were deep-set, gold-green in color, and seemed sensitive to the light. His mother said he got hurt oftener than all the others put together. His mother said he got hurt oftener than all the others put together. He was always trying to ride the colts before they were broken, teasing the turkey gobbler, seeing just how much red the bull would stand for, or how sharp the new axe was. After the concert was over, Antonia brought out a big box full of photographs. She and Anton in their wedding clothes, holding hands, her brother Ambrosch and his very fat wife, who had a farm of her own, and who bossed her husband, I was delighted to hear, the 3 Bohemian Marys and their large families. "You wouldn't believe how steady those girls have turned out," Antonia remarked. "Mary Svoboda's the best butter-maker in all this country, and a fine manager. Her children will have a grand chance." As Antonia turned over the pictures, the young Cusicks stood behind her chair, looking over her shoulder with interested faces. Nina and Jan, after trying to see round the taller ones, quietly brought a chair, climbed up on it, and stood close together, looking. The little boy forgot his shyness and grinned delightedly when familiar faces came into view. In the group about Antonia, I was conscious of a kind of physical harmony. They leaned this way and that, and were not afraid to touch each other. They contemplated the photographs with pleased recognition, looked at some admiringly, as if these characters and their mother's girlhood had been remarkable people. The little children, who could not speak English, murmured comments to each other in their rich old language. Antonia held out a photograph of Lena that had come from San Francisco last Christmas. "Does she still look like that? She hasn't been home for 6 years now." Yes, it was exactly like Lena, I told her, a comely woman, a trifle too plump, in a hat a trifle too large, but with the old lazy eyes, and the old dimpled ingenuousness still lurking at the corners of her mouth. There was a picture of Frances Harling in a befrogged riding costume that I remembered well. "Isn't she fine?" the girls murmured. They all assented. One could see that Frances had come down as a heroine in the family legend. Only Leo was unmoved. "And there's Mr. Harling in his grand fur coat. He was awfully rich, wasn't he, Mother?" "He wasn't any Rockefeller," put in Master Leo in a very low tone, which reminded me of the way in which Mrs. Shimerda had once said that my grandfather wasn't Jesus. His habitual skepticism was like a direct inheritance from that old woman. "None of your smart speeches," said Ambrosch severely. Leo poked out a supple red tongue at him, but a moment later broke into a giggle at a tintype of 2 men, uncomfortably seated, with an awkward-looking boy in baggy clothes standing between them. Jake and Otto and I. We had it taken, I remembered, when we went to Black Hawk on the first 4th of July I spent in Nebraska. I was glad to see Jake's grin again, and Otto's ferocious mustaches. The young Cusicks knew all about them. "He made grandfather's coffin, didn't he?" Anton asked. "Wasn't they good fellows, Jim?" Antonia's eyes filled. "To this day I'm ashamed because I quarreled with Jake that way. I was saucy and impertinent to him, Leo, just like you are with people sometimes, and I wish somebody had made me behave." "We aren't through with you yet," they warned me. They produced a photograph taken just before I went away to college, a tall youth in striped trousers and a straw hat, trying to look easy and jaunty. "Tell us, Mr. Burden," said Charlie, "about the rattler you killed at the dog town. How long was he? Sometimes Mother says 6 feet, and sometimes she says 5. These children seemed to be upon very much the same terms with Antonia as the Harling children had been so many years before. They seemed to feel the same pride in her, and to look to her for stories and entertainment, as we used to do. It was 11 o'clock when I at last took my bag and some blankets and started for the barn with the boys. Their mother came to the door with us, and we tarried for a moment to look out at the white slope of the corral and the 2 ponds asleep in the moonlight, and the long sweep of the pasture under the star-sprinkled sky. The boys told me to choose my own place in the haymow, and I lay down before a big window, left open in warm weather, that looked out into the stars. Ambrosch and Leo cuddled up in a hay-cave, back under the eaves, and lay giggling and whispering. They tickled each other and tossed and tumbled in the hay, and then, all at once, as if they had been shot, they were still. There was hardly a minute between giggles and bland slumber. I lay awake for a long while until the slow-moving moon passed my window on its way up the heavens. I was thinking about Antonia and her children, about Anna's solicitude for her, Ambrosch's grave affection, Leo's jealous, animal little love. That moment, when they all came tumbling out of the cave into the light, was a sight any man might have come far to see. Antonia had always been one to leave images in the mind that did not fade, that grew stronger with time. In my memory there was a succession of such pictures, fixed there like the old woodcuts of one's first primer. Antonia kicking her bare legs against the side of my pony when we came home in triumph with our snake, Antonia in her black shawl and fur cap as she stood by her father's grave in the snowstorm, Antonia coming in with her work team along the evening skyline. She lent herself to immemorial human attitudes which we recognize by instinct as universal and true. I had not been mistaken. She was a battered woman now, not a lovely girl, but she still had that something which fires the imagination, could still stop one's breath for a moment by a look or gesture that somehow revealed the meaning in common things. She had only to stand in the orchard, to put her hand on a little crab tree and look up at the apples, to make you feel the goodness of planting and tending and harvesting at last. All the strong things of her heart came out in her body, that had been so tireless in serving generous emotions. It was no wonder that her sons stood tall and straight. She was a rich mine of life, like the founders of early races. End of Chapter 1 of Book 5. Read by Rachel Ellen, January 14th, 2008. Book 5, Chapter 2 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 5, Cusick's Boys. Chapter 2. When I awoke in the morning, long bands of sunshine were coming in the window and reaching back under the eaves where the two boys lay. Leo was wide awake and was tickling his brother's leg with a dried coneflower he had pulled out of the hay. Ambrose kicked at him and turned over. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. Leo lay on his back, elevated one foot, and began exercising his toes. He picked up dried flowers with his toes and brandished them in the belt of sunlight. After he had amused himself thus for some time, he rose on one elbow and began to look at me, cautiously, then critically, blinking his eyes in the light. His expression was droll. It dismissed me lightly. This old fellow is no different from other people. He doesn't know my secret. He seemed conscious of possessing a keener power of enjoyment than other people. His quick recognitions made him frantically impatient of deliberate judgments. He always knew what he wanted without thinking. After dressing in the hay, I washed my face in cold water at the windmill. Breakfast was ready when I entered the kitchen, and Yulka was baking griddle cakes. The three older boys set off for the fields early. Leo and Yulka were to drive to town to meet their father, who would return from Wilbur on the noon train. "We'll only have a lunch at noon," Antonia said, "and cook the geese for supper, when our papa will be here. I wish my Martha could come down to see you. They have a Ford car now, and she doesn't seem so far away from me as she used to. But her husband's crazy about his farm and about having everything just right, and they almost never get away except on Sundays. He's a handsome boy, and he'll be rich some day. Everything he takes hold of turns out well. When they bring that baby in here and unwrap him, he looks like a little prince. Martha takes care of him so beautiful. I'm reconciled to her for being away from me now, but at first I cried like I was putting her into her coffin." We were alone in the kitchen, except for Anna, who was pouring cream into the churn. She looked up at me. Yes, she did. We were just ashamed of Mother. She went round crying when Martha was so happy and the rest of us were all glad. Joe certainly was patient with you, Mother. Antonia nodded and smiled at herself. I know it was silly, but I couldn't help it. I wanted her right here. She'd never been away from me a night since she was born. If Anton had made trouble about her when she was a baby, or wanted me to leave her with my mother, I wouldn't have married him. I couldn't, but he always loved her like she was his own. I didn't even know Martha wasn't my full sister until after she was engaged to Joe, Anna told me. Toward the middle of the afternoon the wagon drove in, with the father and the eldest son. I was smoking in the orchard, and as I went out to meet them, Antonia came running down from the house and hugged the two men as if they had been away for months. Papa interested me from my first glimpse of him. He was shorter than his older sons, a crumpled little man, with run-over boot heels, and he carried one shoulder higher than the other. But he moved very quickly, and there was an air of jaunty liveliness about him. He had a strong, ruddy color, thick black hair, a little grizzled, a curly mustache, and red lips. His smile showed the strong teeth of which his wife was so proud, and as he saw me, his lively, quizzical eyes told me that he knew all about me. He looked like a humorous philosopher who had hitched up one shoulder under the burdens of life and gone on his way having a good time when he could. He advanced to meet me and gave me a hard hand, burned red on the back and heavily coated with hair. He wore his Sunday clothes, very thick and hot for the weather, an unstarched white shirt, and a blue necktie with big white dots, like a little boy's, tied in a flowing bow. Cusick began at once to talk about his holiday. From politeness he spoke in English. "Mamma, I wish you had seen the lady dance on the slack wire in the street at night. They throw a bright light on her, and she floats through the air something beautiful, like a bird. They have a dancing bear, like in the old country, and 2-3 merry-go-round, and people in balloons, and what do you call the big wheel, Rudolph?" "A Ferris wheel." Rudolph entered the conversation in a deep baritone voice. He was 6'2", and had a chest like a young blacksmith. "We went to the big dance in the hall behind the saloon last night, Mother, and I danced with all the girls, and so did Father. I never saw so many pretty girls. It was a bohunk crowd, for sure. We didn't hear a word of English on the street, except from show people, did we, Papa?" Cusick nodded. "And very many send word to you, Antonia. You will excuse," turning to me, "if I tell her." While we walked toward the house, he related incidents and delivered messages in the tongue he spoke fluently, and I dropped a little behind, curious to know what their relations had become, or remained. The two seemed to be on terms of easy friendliness, touched with humor. Clearly she was the impulse, and he the corrective. As they went up the hill, he kept glancing at her sidewise to see whether she got his point or how she received it. I noticed later that he always looked at people sidewise, as a workhorse does at its yoke-mate. Even when he sat opposite me in the kitchen, talking, he would turn his head a little toward the clock or the stove and look at me from the side, but with frankness and good nature. This trick did not suggest duplicity or secretiveness, but merely long habit, as with the horse. He had brought a tintype of himself and Rudolph for Antonia's collection, and several paper bags of candy for the children. He looked a little disappointed when his wife showed him a big box of candy I had got in Denver. She hadn't let the children touch it the night before. He put his candy away in the cupboard, for when she rains, and glanced at the box, chuckling. "I guess you must have heard about how my family ain't so small," he said. Cusick sat down behind the stove and watched his womenfolk and the little children with equal amusement. He had been off dancing with the girls, and forgetting that he was an old fellow, and now his family rather surprised him. He seemed to think it a joke that all these children should belong to him. As the younger ones slipped up to him in his retreat, he kept taking things out of his pockets. Penny dolls, a wooden clown, a balloon pig that was inflated by a whistle. He beckoned to the little boy they called Jan, whispered to him, and presented him with a paper snake, gently, so as not to startle him. Looking over the boy's head, he said to me, "This one is bashful. He gets left." Cusick had brought home with him a roll of illustrated Bohemian papers. He opened them and began to tell his wife the news, much of which seemed to relate to one person. I heard the name Vazakova, repeated several times with lively interest, and presently I asked him whether he were talking about the singer, Maria Vazak. "You know? You have heard, maybe?" he asked incredulously. When I assured him that I had heard her, he pointed out her picture and told me that Vazak had broken her leg, climbing in the Austrian Alps, and would not be able to fill her engagements. He seemed delighted to find that I had heard her sing in London and in Vienna, got out his pipe and lit it to enjoy our talk the better. She came from his part of Prague. His father used to mend her shoes for her when she was a student. Cusick questioned me about her looks, her popularity, her voice, but he particularly wanted to know whether I had noticed her tiny feet, and whether I thought she had saved much money. She was extravagant, of course, but he hoped she wouldn't squander everything and have nothing left when she was old. As a young man, working in Vienna, he had seen a good many artists who were old and poor, making one glass of beer last all evening, and it was not very nice, that. When the boys came in from milking and feeding, the long table was laid, and 2 brown geese, stuffed with apples, were put down sizzling before Antonia. She began to carve, and Rudolph, who sat next to his mother, started the plates on their way. When everybody was served, he looked across the table at me. "Have you been to Black Hawk lately, Mr. Burden? Then I wonder if you've heard about the Cutters." No, I had heard nothing at all about them. "Then you must tell him, son, though it's a terrible thing to talk about at supper. Now, all you children be quiet. Rudolph is going to tell about the murder." "Hurrah, the murder!" the children murmured, looking pleased and interested. Rudolph told his story in great detail, with occasional promptings from his mother or father. Wick Cutter and his wife had gone on living in the house that Antonia and I knew so well, and in the way we knew so well. They grew to be very old people. He shriveled up, Antonia said, until he looked like a little old yellow monkey, for his beard and his fringe of hair never changed color. Mrs. Cutter remained flushed and wild-eyed as we had known her, but as the years passed she became afflicted with a shaking palsy which made her nervous nod continuous instead of occasional. Her hands were so uncertain that she could no longer disfigure china, poor woman. As the couple grew older, they quarreled more and more about the ultimate disposition of their property. A new law was passed in the state, securing the surviving wife a third of her husband's estate under all conditions. Cutter was tormented by the fear that Mrs. Cutter would live longer than he, and that eventually her people, whom he had always hated so violently, would inherit. Their quarrels on this subject passed the boundary of the close-growing cedars, and were heard in the street by whoever wished to loiter and listen. One morning, 2 years ago, Cutter went into the hardware store and bought a pistol, saying he was going to shoot a dog, and adding that he thought he would take a shot at an old cat while he was about it. Here the children interrupted Rudolph's narrative by smothered giggles. Cutter went out behind the hardware store, put up a target, practiced for an hour or so, and then went home. At 6 o'clock that evening, when several men were passing the Cutter house on their way home to supper, they heard a pistol shot. They paused and were looking doubtfully at one another when another shot came crashing through an upstairs window. They ran into the house and found Wick Cutter lying on a sofa in his upstairs bedroom, with his throat torn open, bleeding on a roll of sheets he had placed beside his head. "Walk in, gentlemen," he said weakly. "I am alive, you see, and competent. You are witnesses that I have survived my wife. You will find her in her own room. Please make your examination at once, so that there will be no mistake." One of the neighbors telephoned for a doctor, while the others went into Mrs. Cutter's room. She was lying on her bed, in her nightgown and wrapper, shot through the heart. Her husband must have come in while she was taking her afternoon nap and shot her, holding the revolver near her breast. Her nightgown was burned from the powder. The horrified neighbors rushed back to Cutter. He opened his eyes and said distinctly, "Mrs. Cutter is quite dead, gentlemen, and I am conscious. My affairs are in order." Then Rudolph said, "He let go and died." On his desk the coroner found a letter, dated at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It stated that he had just shot his wife, that any will she might secretly have made would be invalid, as he survived her. He meant to shoot himself at 6 o'clock and would, if he had strength, fire a shot through the window in the hope that passers-by might come in and see him before life was extinct, as he wrote. Now, would you have thought that that man had such a cruel heart? Antonia turned to me after the story was told, to go and do that poor woman out of any comfort she might have from his money after he was gone. "Did you ever hear of anybody else that killed himself for spite, Mr. Burden?" asked Rudolph. I admitted that I hadn't. Every lawyer learns over and over how strong a motive hate can be, but in my collection of legal anecdotes I had nothing to match this one. When I asked how much the estate amounted to, Rudolph said it was a little over $100,000. Cusick gave me a twinkling, sidelong glance. "The lawyers, they got a good deal of it, sure," he said merrily. $100,000. So that was the fortune that had been scraped together by such hard dealing, and that Cutter himself had died for in the end. After supper, Cusick and I took a stroll in the orchard and sat down by the windmill to smoke. He told me his story as if it were my business to know it. His father was a shoemaker, his uncle a furrier, and he, being a younger son, was apprenticed to the latter's trade. You never got anywhere working for your relatives, he said, so when he was a journeyman he went to Vienna and worked in a big fur shop, earning good money. But a young fellow who liked a good time didn't save anything in Vienna. There were too many pleasant ways of spending every night what he'd made in the day. After 3 years there, he came to New York. He was badly advised and went to work on furs during a strike, when the factories were offering big wages. The strikers won, and Cusick was blacklisted. As he had a few $100s ahead, he decided to go to Florida and raise oranges. He had always thought he would like to raise oranges. The second year a hard frost killed his young grove, and he fell ill with malaria. He came to Nebraska to visit his cousin, Antonia Shimerda, and to look about. When he began to look about, he saw Antonia, and she was exactly the kind of girl he had always been hunting for. They were married at once, though he had to borrow money from his cousin to buy the wedding ring. "It was a pretty hard job breaking up this place and making the first crops grow," he said, pushing back his hat and scratching his grizzled hair. "Sometimes I get awful sore on this place and want to quit, but my wife, she always say we better stick it out. The babies come along pretty fast, so it looked like it'd be hard to move anyhow. I guess she was right, all right. We got this place clear now. We pay only $20 an acre then, and I been offered $100. We bought another quarter 10 years ago, and we got it most paid for. We got plenty boys. We can work a lot of land. Yes, she is a good wife for a poor man. She ain't always so strict with me, neither. Sometimes maybe I drink a little too much beer in town, and when I come home she don't say nothing. She don't ask me no questions. We always get along fine, her and me, like at first. The children don't make trouble between us, like sometimes happens." He lit another pipe and pulled on it contentedly. I found Cusack a most companionable fellow. He asked me a great many questions about my trip through Bohemia, about Vienna, and the Ringstrasse, and the theaters. "Gee, I'd like to go back there once when the boys is big enough to farm the place. Sometimes when I read the papers from the old country, I pretty near run away," he confessed with a little laugh. "I never did think how I would be a settled man like this." He was still, as Antonia said, a city man. He liked theaters and lighted streets and music and a game of dominoes after the day's work was over. His sociability was stronger than his acquisitive instinct. He liked to live day by day and night by night, sharing in the excitement of the crowd. Yet his wife had managed to hold him here on a farm, in one of the loneliest countries in the world. I could see the little chap, sitting here every evening by the windmill, nursing his pipe and listening to the silence, the wheeze of the pump, the grunting of the pigs, and occasional squawking when the hens were disturbed by a rat. It did rather seem to me that Cusick had been made the instrument of Antonia's special mission. This was a fine life, certainly, but it wasn't the kind of life he had wanted to live. I wondered whether the life that was right for one was ever right for two. I asked Cusick if he didn't find it hard to do without the gay company he had always been used to. He knocked his pipe against an upright, sighed, and dropped it in his pocket. "At first I'd near go crazy with lonesomeness," he said frankly, "but my woman has got such a warm heart. She always make it as good for me as she could. Now it ain't so bad. I can begin to have some fun with my boys already." As we walked toward the house, Cusick cocked his hat jauntily over one ear and looked up at the moon. "Gee," he said in a hushed voice, as if he had just wakened up, "it don't seem like I am away from there 26 years." End of Chapter 2 of Book 5. Recorded by Rachel Ellen in Yosemite, California, January 26, 2008. Book 5, Chapter 3 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 5, Cusick's Boys. Chapter 3. After dinner the next day I said good-bye and drove back to Hastings to take the train for Black Hawk. Antonia and her children gathered round my buggy before I started, and even the little ones looked up at me with friendly faces. Leo and Ambrose ran ahead to open the lane gate. When I reached the bottom of the hill, I glanced back. The group was still there by the windmill. Antonia was waving her apron. At the gate, Ambrose lingered beside my buggy, resting his arm on the wheel rim. Leo slipped through the fence and ran off into the pasture. "That's like him," his brother said with a shrug. "He's a crazy kid. Maybe he's sorry to have you go, and maybe he's jealous. He's jealous of anybody Mother makes a fuss over, even the priest." I found I hated to leave this boy, with his pleasant voice and his fine head and eyes. He looked very manly as he stood there without a hat, the wind rippling his shirt about his brown neck and shoulders. "Don't forget that you and Rudolph are going hunting with me up on the Niobrara next summer," I said. "Your father's agreed to let you off after harvest." He smiled. "I won't likely forget. I've never had such a nice thing offered to me before. I don't know what makes you so nice to us boys," he added, blushing. "Oh, yes, you do," I said, gathering up my reins. He made no answer to this except to smile at me with unabashed pleasure and affection as I drove away. My day in Black Hawk was disappointing. Most of my old friends were dead or had moved away. Strange children, who meant nothing to me, were playing in the Harlings' big yard when I passed. The mountain ash had been cut down, and only a sprouting stump was left of the tall Lombardy poplar that used to guard the gate. I hurried on. The rest of the morning I spent with Anton Jelinek, under a shady cottonwood tree in the yard behind his saloon. While I was having my midday dinner at the hotel, I met one of the old lawyers who was still in practice, and he took me up to his office and talked over the Cutter case with me. After that, I scarcely knew how to put in the time until the night express was due. I took a long walk north of the town, out into the pastures where the land was so rough that it had never been plowed up, and the long red grass of early times still grew shaggy over the draws and hillocks. Out there I felt at home again. Overhead the sky was that indescribable blue of autumn, bright and shadowless, hard as enamel. To the south I could see the dun-shaded river bluffs that used to look so big to me, and all about stretched drying cornfields, of the pale gold color I remembered so well. Russian thistles were blowing across the uplands and piling against the wire fences like barricades. Along the cattle paths, the plumes of goldenrod were already fading into sun-warmed velvet, gray with gold threads in it. I had escaped from the curious depression that hangs over little towns, and my mind was full of pleasant things, trips I meant to take with the Cusick boys, in the Badlands and up on the stinking water. There were enough Cusick's to play with for a long while yet. Even after the boys grew up, there would always be Cusick himself. I meant to tramp along a few miles of lighted streets with Cusick. As I wandered over those rough pastures, I had the good luck to stumble upon a bit of the first road that went from Black Hawk out to the north country, to my grandfather's farm, then on to the Shimerdas and to the Norwegian settlement. Everywhere else it had been plowed under when the highways were surveyed. This half-mile or so within the pasture fence was all that was left of that old road which used to run like a wild thing across the open prairie, clinging to the high places and circling and doubling like a rabbit before the hounds. On the level land the tracks had almost disappeared, were mere shadings in the grass, and a stranger would not have noticed them. But wherever the road had crossed a draw, it was easy to find. The rains had made channels of the wheel ruts and washed them so deep that the sod had never healed over them. They looked like gashes torn by a grizzly's claws, on the slopes where the farm wagons used to lurch up out of the hollows with a pull that brought curling muscles on the smooth hips of the horses. I sat down and watched the haystacks turn rosy in the slanting sunlight. This was the road over which Antonia and I came on that night when we got off the train at Black Hawk and were bedded down in the straw, wondering children, being taken we knew not whither. I had only to close my eyes to hear the rumbling of the wagons in the dark, and to be again overcome by that obliterating strangeness. The feelings of that night were so near that I could reach out and touch them with my hand. I had the sense of coming home to myself, and of having found out what a little circle man's experience is. For Antonia and me, this had been the road of destiny, had taken us to those early accidents of fortune which predetermined for us all that we can ever be. Now I understood that the same road was to bring us together again. Whatever we had missed, we possessed together the precious, the incommunicable past. End of Chapter 3 of Book 5. And End of My Antonia by Willa Cather. This has been a LibriVox recording by Rachel Ellen, February 1st, 2008.